Arya listened to the quiet drip of water as she sat cross-legged on the damp stone floor, deep in the catacombs beneath the House of Black and White. Her eyes were open, but her pupils had dilated so wide in the dim candlelight that she saw the world as a murky wash of gray. The walls around her smelled of old tombs and the salt that drifted through the Bravosian air. A single candle flickered in a tiny alcove at the far end of the cramped space. All else was silence. To the girl who had once been Arya of House Stark, that silence meant more than any prayer, any vow, any word spoken by man or God. It was the promise of oblivion, and it was also her weapon. She inhaled slowly. In the blackness behind her eyelids, she could almost feel the presence of the many-faced God. She had repeated the prayer in her head so many times that it had long since ceased to be a prayer. It was a litany. It was her heartbeat. The names still came to her at night, spoken by the ghosts of her past. Cersei Lannister, Walder Frey, Eileen Payne, Meryn Trant, the Hound, the Mountain. The list had shortened and lengthened in time, depending on who had wronged her or her family. Some names had slipped away, forgiven or forgotten, or killed by other means. Some she'd struck herself. Meryn Trant lay dead already. Others had perished at the hands of greater forces, like Eileen Payne rotting away from some slow malady, or men who died in battles far from her blade. Yet the heart of it remained. The big names, the final names, the ones who had almost seemed invincible when she was just a little girl from Winterfell. No more. She was not a little girl now. She was no one, and in the hush of that catacomb, she allowed herself one last indulgence. A final vow to the child she had been. A vow to see this through. And then she released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She took the candle and snuffed it with her fingers, ignoring the sting. Darkness bloomed, thick as ink. She closed her eyes, letting that darkness sink into her bones. By the time she stood and felt her way toward the carved steps leading back to the House of Black and White above, Arya Stark was gone. A faceless assassin emerged in her place. No one had a task to complete. She moved like a specter through the labyrinth beneath the temple. She knew every corridor now, every hidden niche and door. She had cleaned the faces, prepared the bodies, served quietly in the sanctuary above. She had scraped the floor and poured poison into the cups of the dying. She had watched men and women come to the House of Black and White for their final rest. She had studied them, learned the shapes of their faces, the textures of their skin and hair. She had listened to their confessions, real or false. She had learned to question everything, even her own identity. She had learned to lie until the truth meant nothing. And then, one day, the kindly man had stood in front of her, a face she had never quite been able to see clearly, and spoke. A girl has served the many-faced God well. A girl has no name, and a girl may go. No more instructions were necessary. She rose that morning, took a modest coin purse, a set of plain clothes, and stepped out of the House of Black and White onto the canals of Braavos. She did not look back. No one's heart pounded in her chest, for there was no fear. The journey was as inevitable as a sunrise. She took a small skiff across the narrow sea, blending easily with the faceless throngs of travelers. She had the knowledge, the skill, and the blessings of her order. The last names on her list were in Westeros. The time had come to see them ended by her hand. Every last one. When she arrived on the shores of the north, that wild, cold wind whipped at her hood. She remembered that wind. She remembered the crisp scent of pine and snow. Yet she refused to let the old memories sway her. Arya Stark might have known tears at this reunion, might have rushed to find her brother or sister. But she was not Arya, not anymore. She was the blade of the many-faced God. She was a coil of vengeance, set in motion many years ago, when her father lost his head and the world she knew burned down around her. It did not matter that other wars were raging, that kings rose and fell. She walked among the crowds of White Harbor, and no one noticed her. No one saw the small figure cloaked in brown, stepping lightly off a Braavosi vessel. They did not see the dagger pressed against her thigh, the kit of poisons in her bag, the intricate knowledge of pressure points. They did not see the meticulous forms she had learned in Bravos, forms as fluid as water. They did not see the hours of discipline. They saw nothing at all. Only when she was settled in a small tavern at the outskirts of White Harbor did she allow herself a moment's pause. She mulled over a cup of watered ale, gazing at the pale foam that trembled around the rim. Her mind flickered through each name like a raven sorting through letters. There were but 3 that mattered now, truly mattered. She'd heard rumors of Walder Frey's demise. Supposedly, he had died at his own table one night, felled by poison. The rumor claimed that someone wearing a girl's face slit his throat, leaving him to bleed on the floor. The rumor claimed that all Freys in the hall had died after toasting a victory they never saw. Arya recalled that night in a distant, dreamlike way. She remembered the heat of the torches, the smell of roasted meat, and the sour stench of fear when she revealed her face. She remembered the feeling of Walder Frey's skin under her hand, how easy it was to slit a man's throat once you'd prepared all the rest so carefully. That memory warmed her. Walder Frey was no longer on the list. He was gone. But Cersei Lannister was very much alive. That name alone burned in her thoughts. Cersei was the queen. If queen was even the right word, for the throne had changed hands so many times. Rumor had it she still sat in power at King's Landing, her crown precarious, overshadowed by dragons, wars, rebellions, and all manner of chaos. Perhaps she was the easiest to find, ironically, yet the most difficult to kill because the Red Keep was thick with gold cloaks and spies. And there was Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, or the Undead Mountain, as whispers called him, for no one truly believed he was still human. The stories about him were monstrous. He never removed his helm, never spoke, only served as Cersei's silent enforcer. Killing him would be as difficult as plucking a star from the sky. Arya licked her lips at the thought, a small quiver of excitement stirring in her chest. She had escaped him once, but now was different, for she had no fear of death and her skill was unmatched. The Hound's name had once been on her list, but she had left him to die near the Vale. She had stood over his broken body once, refusing him mercy. Rumor said he had survived, or perhaps died and rose again. She recalled the nights she spent wandering with him, the grudging respect that had grown inside her, the hatred that never quite dissolved. Sandor Clegane was not a name that burned like the others anymore, but she had promised to kill him. A small part of her, the girl from Winterfell, might have felt differently, might have allowed him a semblance of redemption, but that vow had been carved into her soul. If she was to be no one, she could not let that vow linger. She would finish what she started. 3. The list was 3 now, and she let it guide her mind like the smell of fresh blood in the water. She finished her ale in silence, left a single coin on the rough-hewn table, and vanished into the night. She took a horse from a stable a few leagues down the road, though whether she purchased it or stole it was something only she would ever know. She was proficient at blending into markets, forging or finessing coin, and slipping out again before the stallkeeper suspected a thing. She rode south under the veil of night, rarely stopping except to eat or rest the horse. By day, she might hide in some farmer's barn or doze in the shade of a rocky outcropping, trusting the speed of her well-chosen mount to carry her onward. All the while, she wore her many faces: the kindly old grandmother, the traveling minstrel, the cunning merchant's boy. She had them all stored in her memory, and with the slightest shift of posture and a bag of carefully prepared masks, she became them, voice and mannerisms changing in an instant. Even her eyes seemed to shift color, so easily did she adopt her guises. It was as if the many-faced God himself had granted her a measure of supernatural ability. But she knew better. It was simply skill, training, devotion. She had spent so long perfecting the art of being no one that it was like breathing. Each time she passed a checkpoint or slipped through a guarded gate, no one stopped her. No one gave her a second look. She was invisible in her many forms, as though all the world conspired to shield her from prying eyes. That was her greatest power. She saw everything, but no one saw her. Thus, she came at last to the outskirts of King's Landing. She smelled the city before she saw it. That putrid mix of waste, smoke, and sweat. Once, this city had been the seat of her greatest nightmares. She had watched her father's head on a spike here. She had run through the alleyways with hot pie and gendry, fleeing gold cloaks. This was the city that had devoured the life she'd known. And at its rotten core, the one who had orchestrated so much of her family's downfall. Cersei Lannister. The walls were as tall as she remembered, the gates crowded with refugees, merchants, soldiers. The war and the winter had driven many into the capital, seeking a scrap of safety. The Iron Throne was fracturing the realm once more. She heard whispered rumors of alliances and betrayals. The Targaryen queen, Daenerys Stormborn, had come and gone, or so the stories said, leaving the city in partial ruin. Yet Cersei remained, clinging to what vestiges of power she could. For the first time in days, Arya, if one could call her that, allowed herself the flicker of a smile. She would give the Lannister lioness something else to worry about. She donned the face of a middle-aged woman with thinning hair and a dull expression. She carried a modest basket of dried fish over one arm, assuming the manner of a poor fishwife hoping to sell her wares. She'd paid off one of the real fishwives by the docks, swapping identities with a few bits of silver. The woman had been more than happy to vanish into a local tavern and gamble or drink her coin. Meanwhile, Arya, no one, slipped seamlessly into the flow of traffic through the gate. The guards did not glance twice at her. Even if they had, all they would see was a scrawny woman with cracked hands and a weary stoop, her face set in that resigned grimace the impoverished wore so well. She had practiced it in her nights riding south, contorting her features until the face felt second nature. So she passed the gate, entered King's Landing proper, and let the squalid chaos wash over her. The city was a living creature. Its streets were veins, clogged with the blood of thousands jostling for space. Merchants hawked goods from wooden stalls. Children ran underfoot. Soldiers marched in clusters, their eyes scanning the crowd for any spark of trouble. Rats scurried in the gutters, filth seeped into the dirt, and the wind carried the smell of rotting fish from the wharves. It was midday, and the pale sun offered little warmth. People gossiped about the Queen's latest decree, about rumored parley with northern lords. Some whispered fearfully of White Walkers, though the city had seen none. Others spoke of dragons, though apparently none perched upon the Red Keep's battlements any longer. The capital was a swirl of rumors and fear, pulled tight under Cersei's iron grip. Arya walked carefully along the cobblestones, her basket swaying at her hip, occasionally feigning a call, "Fish! Salt fish for sale." The accent was local, a coarse flea-bottom rasp she'd heard 1,000 times in her youth. The posture, the expression, the timbre of her voice. She had them all perfect. And beneath that mask, her gray eyes flickered over each face she passed, searching. First, she needed a foothold in the city, a vantage point where she could learn the new routines of the Queen. She had once heard that a slip of a servant, well-placed, knew more than any spymaster. So she found an inn near the Street of Silk, one that catered to traveling merchants rather than lords. She rented a small, dingy room with 2 cots that smelled of fleas. She paid a half-silver in coin and told the innkeep she might stay a day or a week, depending on her luck in selling fish. The innkeep didn't care. The coin was real enough, and that was all that mattered. That night, she slipped from her room dressed in dark rags, her real face covered by a cowl. She moved across the city's rooftops and back alleys like a shadow. She knew these streets. King's Landing had changed with the war, but the shape of its labyrinthine corridors was still recognizable. The twist of gutters, the lines of laundry overhead, the pungent stench that got worse the closer one wandered to Flea Bottom. She scaled walls, hopped from ledge to ledge, and listened at windows. She wanted rumors, secrets. She wanted to know how the Red Keep was guarded these days, how frequently the Gold Cloaks patrolled, how close the mountain stayed to Cersei's side. She gathered bits and pieces. Soldiers stationed at each gate into the castle yard. Hints that Cersei spent more time locked away in her private chambers, relying on the Red Keep's complicated network of corridors for movement. Whispers that the Queen was paranoid, seeing assassins in every corner, commanding Qyburn's little birds to ferret out any sign of disloyalty. Many said she was near mad with suspicion, and Gregor Clegane was never more than a few steps away from her. A towering figure in steel who never spoke and was rumored not even to eat or sleep. Some spat on the ground, calling him an abomination. Others simply muttered a prayer to the Seven, as if praying for deliverance from that monstrous presence. Good, Arya thought. Fear makes people predictable. The more frightened Cersei was, the more she'd cling to the few things she trusted, namely, the castle walls, her few loyal supporters, and the monstrous knight who served as her shield. That predictability was what Arya needed. She spent that first week quietly weaving herself into the small folks' daily routines. By day, she was the fishwife, selling meager strips of salted cod to passers-by. By night, she was a silent wraith, slinking past half-drunk guards, eavesdropping on frantic servants. She gleaned how the queen preferred to eat her supper in her chambers, usually served by a carefully vetted staff of kitchen servants. The wine was tested, the food was tested, the plates were tested, so poison might be too risky. Cersei had learned from her mistakes or from the fates of men like Joffrey. If Arya tried to slip poison into her meal, Qyburn's watchers would likely catch the slightest anomaly. That path was closed. The second approach was the Great Hall. Occasionally, Cersei presided over minor matters of court, listening to supplicants. Gregor stood behind her, silent as death, while the queen's eyes, lined with sleepless smudges, surveyed the trembling supplicants. To get close enough in that setting, Arya would need the right face, and a weapon that could slip past many watchers. Then again, the supplicants were patted down, corralled by gold cloaks, and forced to stand at a distance. Not impossible, but complicated. The third approach was infiltration. Slipping into the Red Keep's labyrinth, passing as a servant or guard, and sneaking into the queen's presence in the dead of night. That path was equally fraught. The keep was a fortress, and Cersei had tightened security even further since her coronation. The place was crawling with watchers. She had no shortage of coin to pay off spies, no shortage of zealots who wanted to curry favor. Yet Arya was unafraid. She had been a mouse in Harrenhal before, scurrying under Tywin Lannister's nose. She had walked unnoticed in the halls of the many-faced god for years. No fortress was impregnable to her. She only needed time to find the right door. Night after night, she ventured closer to the Red Keep, mapping the patrols, testing how the gates were locked. She noticed which guards yawned, which lingered at corners for a chat, which dozed off during late watch. She learned when the kitchens cooled, when the candles guttered. At times, she used one of her better disguises, a pale-faced, wiry man with an ever-present cough. At others, she was a young girl in a scullion's rags, hair pulled into a tight braid. Each face gave her different vantage points, different excuses to walk the castle halls. She bribed one unwitting guard to let her pass, claiming she had left a pot boiling in the kitchens. She faked a conversation with a passing laundry maid. She let the details swirl in her mind, forming a precise map. All the while, the other name haunted her, Sandor Clegane the Hound. She had heard that at one point he had joined some sort of strange commune, then left it. She heard rumors that he traveled with a band of outlaws under the banner of the Lord of Light, or had fought whites in the north. Conflicting stories placed him in the Riverlands, or east of the Vale. He was nowhere near King's Landing, so for now, she set that name aside. He would keep until after. She had faith that her path would lead her to him in due course. The day of her strike arrived on a rare, cloudless morning. The winter chill made the sky a pale, crisp blue, but the sun offered little warmth, as if it too were dying. Early that morning, Arya had heard from scullions that the queen planned a private audience with several lesser lords in her solar at midday. The meeting was hush-hush, apparently to discuss the problem of grain shortages and shipments from the Reach. Cersei would have fewer guards around her than in the throne room, though Gregor Clegane was certain to be there. Even the mountain had to eat, or at least pretend to. But the lesser lords would presumably bring a small retinue, and the presence of a random servant in that solar might not raise suspicion, so long as she wore the right face. Arya prepared carefully. She made her way to a corner of flea bottom that stank of turnip soup and rancid tallow. There, a certain man known for forging documents plied his trade behind a hidden door. Arya approached him with her fishwife face, only to re-emerge sometime later as a young steward in crisp, Lannister red livery. The signet ring she wore was a near-perfect forgery of a minor house allied to the Lannisters. The face she wore now was that of a dark-haired boy, perhaps 17, with a narrow chin and bright hazel eyes. She even had calluses on her palms from years of stable work, courtesy of the mask and her own attention to detail. She pressed a few coins into the forger's hand and left. With that disguise, she might enter the keep under the pretense of running messages for a certain lord's retinue. She had gleaned enough gossip to know that Lord Martin, a timid bannerman, was coming for the midday meeting. No one would look twice if a new steward accompanied him. Sure enough, at the city gates, she slipped in behind Lord Martin's true retinue. The men in front were too busy laughing and gossiping about how their lord dreaded the queen's temper. When the gate guards motioned the retinue forward, Arya stepped in confidently. The guard's eyes flicked over the group, and upon seeing her, livery and ring, he nodded, bored. They let them pass. Her heart was steady. She was no longer that girl trembling in the shadows. She was a weapon honed to a razor's edge. She had come too far to fail now. Cersei was near, so near. She followed Lord Martin's retinue into the keep, merging with the press of people. Servants bowed, courtiers flashed quick smiles. She listened closely for directions, where the meeting was to be held, which corridor led to the Queen's solar. A guard escorted them through several marble-floored hallways, up 2 flights of stairs, and into a stately antechamber where the lesser lords were told to wait. Arya hung back near the door, feigning the unobtrusive stance of a steward. She glanced around quickly. The walls were painted in dull reds and golds. A single tapestry of a lion devouring a stag hung near a window. 2 gold cloaks stood at attention by the far door, though they looked bored. Another servant bustled out carrying a tray of goblets. Arya moved to take the tray, adopting a subservient posture. She bowed her head, muttered, "I'll see to it, lord," and slid past the unsuspecting servant into the corridor beyond. Inside, the Queen's solar was a lavish room with tall windows overlooking the Blackwater Bay. The ocean glinted in the midday light. The furniture was dark oak, and a heavy Lannister lion crest hung above the hearth. Cersei herself stood by a table near the windows, speaking with a handful of courtiers in hushed tones. Her hair was cut short, the lines around her eyes etched deeply. She wore a gown of black velvet embroidered with gold, the high collar stiff around her neck. Her expression was sour, as if everything around her offended her senses. She had a presence, though. Even from across the room, Arya could feel the force of her personality, as if the air coiled around the Queen. Near Cersei's left shoulder was a towering figure in white armor. The Mountain, Gregor Clegane's helmet covered his face entirely, and the steel seemed too large for any normal man's proportions. A red plume jutted from the helm, swaying slightly as he shifted his bulk. He did not speak or move otherwise. He simply loomed like a statue of intimidation given life. Arya kept her eyes down. She was the steward with the tray. Nothing more. She circled the room, offering drinks to the men. A few nodded or took one. One patted her shoulder absently. Another gave a dismissive grunt. She approached the Queen last, though only so she might get close enough to see the lines of her face. She saw the tension in Cersei's jaw, the faint tremor in her slender fingers. Up close, Cersei looked older. Her once radiant beauty was laced with something brittle, as if fear or anger or heartbreak had carved away the softness. Cersei waved her away with a curt flick of the hand. Arya bowed and backed up, as any well-trained servant might, and placed the tray on a sideboard. The lesser lords began to file in, bowing, scraping, each waiting for Cersei's acknowledgement. She cast them condescending glares, one after another. Then she gestured for them to speak. Outside, the gold cloaks closed the door, presumably to maintain privacy. Arya lingered near the sideboard, half hidden behind a heavy curtain. The men began their pleas, discussing the shortage of supplies, the unrest in their regions, the approach of winter. Cersei grew visibly impatient. She snapped commands at them, insisted they increase production, threatened them with the king's justice if they were found hoarding grain. All the while, Gregor Clegane stood like a silent sentinel behind her. Arya's pulse thrummed. She had a plan for him, or at least the glimmer of one. She carried more than a simple dagger beneath her livery. She had a small phial of a potent substance gleaned from bravos, a thick, honey-like poison that attacked muscles and sinews in seconds. If only she could administer it to Gregor. The man might not even be alive in the normal sense, but perhaps it would slow him or distract him just long enough for Arya to strike. She had read that some poisons even the undead might not withstand. But how to get it onto him? Slip it into the slats of his armor? Use a coated needle? She studied him, searching for any gap in that thick plate, any sign of vulnerability. The meeting dragged on. Cersei gestured for one of the lords to approach the table. That was when Arya noticed that the mountain took a single step to the side, opening a small path for the lord to stand near the queen. Gregor's left arm shifted, the plate revealing a slight gap at the underside of his elbow, thick with chain mail but not fully sealed. A cunning assassin might slip a needle through there, if she was quick, if she was close enough, if no one noticed. It was dangerous, but Arya had thrived on danger for years. She readied herself, letting her body sink into the calculated calm she had mastered in bravos. She moved quietly forward, tray in hand once more, as if to offer wine to the next lord stepping up. She circled around the mountain's flank. Her footsteps made no sound. The lords were too busy bickering with one another to notice the steward's slight detour. Cersei glanced only once in her direction, saw the livery, dismissed her. Gregor did not move. The hiss of breath beneath that helm was barely audible. Arya feigned a stumble, dropping to one knee as though she had slipped on the polished floor. The tray clattered. The lord in front of her let out a small yelp, stepping aside. Wine splashed across the floor. In that instant, Arya's hand darted under her tunic, seizing the thin, hollow needle she had prepared. She spun, reached beneath the mountain's arm, and drove the needle through the tiny gap in his plate. She felt resistance immediately. His chain mail was thick, but she pressed with all her might, calling upon every lesson from the house of black and white. The tip of the needle found a fraction of flesh, or what passed for flesh. She squeezed, injecting the poison. It was done in a heartbeat, masked by the confusion of her spilled wine. Then she jerked back, letting the needle slip out. She stowed it inside her sleeve and blinked up with wide, apologetic eyes. "Clumsy fool," snarled the nearest lord. He scowled down at her, oblivious to what had just transpired. She bowed her head. "Beg pardon, M-Lord. Let me fetch a rag." She scrambled to her feet, face flushed as though mortified by her own ineptitude. Cersei barely spared her a glance. The queen's scornful gaze flickered to the spilled wine. "Clean it up and be gone." Arya bobbed a frantic bow and hurried toward the sideboard, picking up a cloth. She dabbed at the floor, using the motion to see if Gregor reacted. The giant remained still, as if unperturbed. Perhaps the poison did nothing. Perhaps he truly was a walking corpse, immune to mortal toxins. Arya felt a flicker of doubt. What if it had no effect at all? Then she saw his gauntlet hand twitch at his side. Cersei did not notice, too busy giving instructions to the lords about supply lines. But Arya saw the faint tremor, the reflexive clench of the giant's fist. She waited. One moment, too. Suddenly, Gregor's entire arm jerked as if seized by a spasm. The helm turned. A rasping grunt escaped. The lords froze. Cersei whirled in alarm. "Ser Gregor?" she said sharply, stepping back from him. Another spasm ran through the mountain's body. He half lifted his sword arm, then let it drop. His breathing sounded wet, ragged. The nearest lord stumbled backward, nearly toppling a chair. Arya saw her chance. She dropped the cloth and seized the wooden platter she had set aside. There was a small, hidden sheath underneath, holding a slim dagger of Valyrian steel. She drew it silently. Chaos erupted. Gregor let out a guttural roar, more animal than man. He lurched forward. His helm clanked violently as if he were in pain or in fury. One of the lords gasped, "The mountain's gone mad!" Another scrambled for the door, shouting for the guards. Cersei's eyes flared with terror. She moved to retreat, but the giant knight reeled dangerously, nearly clipping her with his flailing arm. Arya was upon them. All that training in bravos, all those hours spent sparring blind, balancing on narrow ledges, came alive in her blood. She moved with lethal grace. Ducking the mountain's erratic swing, she darted forward, aiming for the gap in his gorget beneath the helm. The poison might be working, but she could not rely on it alone to bring him down. A single, precise thrust would finish him if she found the right spot. She slashed with the Valyrian steel dagger. The edge cut deep into the chain mail at his neck, scraping metal, biting into flesh. A blackish fluid oozed from the wound, not quite normal blood. Gregor snarled, tried to backhand her, but his movements were jerky. She spun away, slicing again. Another gout of that unnatural fluid. The giant took a knee, armor clanging. Cersei screamed, "Guards! Guards!" She stumbled backward in horror, eyes riveted on the horrifying sight of her champion kneeling, blackness spilling from the rents in his armor. Arya pressed the attack mercilessly. She had to end him now, before the gold cloaks stormed in. She drove the dagger up through the base of the mountain skull, an opening just above the collar of the breastplate. The blade bit home, and for a moment, Gregor froze. Then a rattling sigh escaped him, and he collapsed heavily to the floor. Arya had slain the unkillable. Time slowed. She saw the shock in Cersei's eyes, saw the queen struggling to comprehend. Then the door burst open, and half a dozen Lannister guards poured in, weapons drawn. Arya did not hesitate. She flung herself toward Cersei, letting the dagger lead. The queen stumbled back against the table. Her eyes locked on Arya's face, which was that of a stranger's. She did not know who or what was coming for her, only that it was death. The guards yelled, "Step back!" But Arya was already upon the queen, seizing her wrist, spinning her around. She pressed the dagger to Cersei's throat. The queen clawed at her arm, face contorted in hatred and fear. The guards halted, swords leveled, uncertain. In that heartbeat of stillness, Arya allowed herself one final look at her greatest foe. This was the woman who had orchestrated her father's death, who had brought ruin upon House Stark. Arya thought of her mother, her brother, all lost at the Red Wedding. She thought of Sansa's suffering, of every heartbreak that had led her here. Her eyes burned. For an instant, she felt a flicker of pity or remorse, or maybe it was just an echo of the old Arya stirring in the darkness. Then it vanished. Cersei's nails dug into Arya's arm. She spat, "Who are you?" Arya said nothing. She kept her voice silent, a vessel of the many-faced god. The blade cut across Cersei's throat in a swift motion. The queen gasped, eyes wide, blood gushing from the deep gash. She sagged to her knees, her life spilling out over the polished floor. The dagger's Valyrian steel shone red. Cersei tried to speak, but the words never formed. She slumped forward, choking on her own blood. Then she fell still, her golden hair matted with crimson. The queen was dead. A hush claimed the solar. Time rushed back in. "No!" one of the guards bellowed, charging forward. Arya sprang away from Cersei's body, letting it drop lifelessly to the floor. Two of the guards lunged, swords slashing. She spun, parried one blow with her dagger. Another sword whistled past her ear. She slipped behind a chair, kicking it into one guard's path. The chair tangled his legs, and he tumbled with a shout. Arya darted for the side door, the one that presumably led to a private corridor or reading nook. A guard blocked her path, thrusting a spear. She sidestepped, slashed his arm, then rammed her shoulder into him. He stumbled, and she was through. She sprinted down the corridor, ignoring the shouts behind her. Her disguise was blood-spattered, worthless now. She had only seconds before the entire Red Keep would be swarming with soldiers, and the city gates would slam shut. They would search every corner for the assassin. She fled deeper into the castle, relying on her memorized map of corridors. She slipped into a servant's staircase, rushing down 2 flights. From there, she found a narrow hallway leading to the kitchens. Yes, the kitchens, she knew them. She had gleaned the schedule. The midday meal was still being prepared, so the kitchen was full of bustling cooks. Her presence might be momentarily hidden among them. She barreled through the swinging door. A cook let out a startled yelp. Pots clanged. Scullions scattered. Before any of them could react, Arya snatched a spare cloak from a peg on the wall and flung it over her shoulders. She dipped behind a large barrel, yanking off her false face with practiced haste. She replaced it with an older woman's visage she had stored in her bag. Her real face, for what that was worth, never saw the light. She heard the pounding of boots in the corridors. Shouts of "Find her! The queen is dead!" rang out. Arya forced herself to breathe steadily. Another mask, another persona. She tucked away the soiled livery and walked out the other side of the kitchen, stooped and limping like an elderly woman. The cooks stared, but they did not stop her. They were too shocked by the sudden commotion. By the time the gold cloaks burst in, barking questions, Arya had vanished through the back corridor that opened onto the yard. Out in the yard, the chaos was already spreading. Bells began to toll from the towers, the alarm echoing across the city. People rushed around in confusion. Soldiers formed ranks, anticipating some riot or invasion. Arya kept her hood low and joined a group of washerwomen huddling by a wall. They whispered and pointed, breathless with rumors. Someone had attacked the queen in her solar. The mountain was down, blood everywhere. Arya feigned fear and concern, blending in with the trembling throng. A group of guards rushed past, oblivious to her presence. When the moment was right, she slipped into a corner, scaled a low section of the wall, and dropped into a deserted alley behind the castle complex. She made her way through the winding alleys of King's Landing, the bells clanging behind her. Patrols were everywhere, but she avoided them deftly, using side streets and rooftops. Her training in bravos served her well. By late afternoon, she reached the ramshackle inn in Flea Bottom where she had stashed her horse. People were already talking of the queen's death as though it were some fable. Half the city was either cowering or celebrating. Some hated Cersei enough to rejoice in her murder. Others feared what would come next. Arya did not care about their talk. She went to the stable behind the inn, found her horse, and calmly guided it out into the dusty street. No one dared stop the old woman hobbling along, leading a horse. If anything, they assumed she was someone's grandmother, come to fetch the beast. The gold cloaks were searching for a younger assassin, dressed in Lannister livery, or so the rumors said. Arya was not that. She was no one. She did not linger. She mounted outside the city gates once she'd slipped through the chaotic lines of refugees. Then she rode. By nightfall, she was many miles from King's Landing, heading north again. Only once she was safe in the darkness of the countryside did she finally remove the elderly face. She stared into the small mirror she carried, into the visage of the traveler she had chosen next. A nondescript merchant. So many faces, none of them truly hers. She thought of Cersei's final, terrified gaze. She thought of the black gore that had spilled from the mountain's armor, the queen's shock that her unstoppable champion had failed her. She thought of the hush that had fallen in the solar as Cersei's lifeblood pooled on the floor. She had done it. A name that had echoed in her prayers for years was finally crossed off. She wondered if her father would be proud, or if it would sadden him to see her reduced to this instrument of vengeance. It did not matter. Ned Stark was long dead, and she was no one. She pressed her lips into a firm line and spurred her horse onward. They rode for days through rolling hills, over half-frozen streams, across farmland battered by war. Everywhere, she saw the scars of the conflict that had ravaged Westeros. Burned villages, fields left untended, people with hollow cheeks searching for scraps. The realm was unraveling at the seams, even though the final battles in the far north had played out. The aftershocks of the war hammered the small folk daily. Arya thought of Winterfell, of the siblings she had left behind. Did they still live? Jon, Sansa, Bran, Rickon, so many parted ways, so many unknown fates. But she did not dwell on it. She had a mission. She had a list. Only 2 names remained now, though arguably she had removed Gregor Clegane the same moment she took Cersei. Was the Hound next, or was he truly dead? The rumors were too contradictory to trust. She recalled the vow she made over his broken body, the rage she felt then. But time had softened that rage, shaped it into a different sense of purpose. Still, a vow was a vow. Weeks passed as she traveled north again. The land grew colder, the nights longer. She shifted faces often to avoid detection, especially at major crossroads where Lord's men or sellswords might be roving. Word of the Queen's murder had spread throughout the 7 kingdoms like wildfire, fueling countless rumors. Some said it was Tyrion Lannister, her hated dwarf brother, who had sneaked into King's Landing for revenge. Others blamed Daenerys Targaryen or Sansa Stark. Some whispered it was the spirit of the High Sparrow, come back to exact a final punishment. No one spoke of a small, faceless steward or a nobody. That was precisely what Arya wanted. Only when she was deep into the Riverlands did she begin to pick up on stories that the Hound might be traveling with a band of outlaws. Some believed they had gone to help rebuild after the wars, to protect scattered villages from roving brigands. Others claimed to have seen a tall man with half a burned face in a small sept, lighting candles for the dead. Arya followed each rumor like a bloodhound on a scent, zigzagging through muddy roads and forested paths. She was patient. Killing Cersei was the main event, but she would not let any vow remain undone. At last, her search led her to an abandoned farmstead near the Trident. The fields were desolate, the barn half collapsed. But the main house still stood, though the roof was patched with fresh timber. She arrived near dusk, her steps cautious. She had heard from a passing peddler that a group of men had holed up here, men who were neither brigands nor lords, just travelers who sometimes helped locals and sometimes demanded supplies in return. Among them was a large man with a mutilated face. She crept closer, finding a vantage point behind an old stone wall. A thin ribbon of smoke coiled from the farmhouse chimney, and she saw a large shape chopping wood out front. The man wore a hooded cloak, but when he straightened, she caught a glimpse of his face. The right side burnt and scarred, as if melted by flame. It was Sandor Clegane, the Hound, alive. She studied him for a long while. He moved stiffly, as though weighed down by old injuries, but the power in his frame was still apparent. He split logs in a single stroke, piling them methodically. Occasionally, a second figure came out to speak with him, a man with a scraggly beard and a missing eye, possibly one of the Brotherhood without banners or some similar group. They shared a few words, then parted. The Hound resumed his task, shoulders hunched as if he'd rather not be disturbed. Arya felt a surprising tug of hesitation. This was the man she once despised. The man who had taken her from King's Landing, who had stolen her away, who had killed her friend, the butcher's boy. She had sworn to kill him, but she also remembered the nights they spent fleeing together. She remembered the strange, grudging respect that had developed between them. She remembered how he had protected her more than once, how his cynicism was a shield against the cruelty of the world. She remembered leaving him to die, yet she had promised him death. She felt the familiar coldness settle in her bones, the assassin's calm. This was the final name, the final vow that still carried weight. She had told herself that she would keep her word, and she would unless he was truly changed but no, the vow was a vow. The many-faced god demanded the repayment of all debts. Night came. She waited, concealed by darkness. The Hound and his companions retired inside. Lantern light glowed through the shutters. A faint murmur of conversation reached her ears. She crept closer, silent as a cat, circling the farmhouse until she found a side door. It was barred from within, but a window overhead was left slightly ajar to vent smoke. She climbed up carefully, edging along the splintered frame. Inside, she saw the Hound sitting at a rough-hewn table, gulping from a bowl of stew. 2 others sat near him, engaged in muted conversation. None were heavily armed. The Hound's sword leaned against the wall. Arya considered her approach. A stealthy kill from behind might be easiest, but the Hound was quick and these men might raise alarm. Also, something in her resisted the idea of slitting his throat while he ate stew. She wanted him to see her face, or at least a face. She wanted him to know. She slipped back down, circled around to the front, where a shuttered window gave a clearer view. Through a gap in the wood, she spied the Hound finishing his meal, wiping the bowl with a piece of bread. One of the men rose, rubbed his eyes, and said good night. The other began to doze by the fireside. The Hound sat quietly for a moment, staring into the flames as if lost in thought. Then he stood, took his sword from the wall, and walked toward a smaller side room. A moment later, she heard the dull thud of him setting the sword in a corner. He seemed to prefer sleeping near his steel, like any soldier with lingering nightmares. Arya took a breath, then tested the door. It was bolted, but the latch was old. She withdrew a thin pick from her belt, eased it between the wood, and carefully lifted the bar. It made a faint scraping sound. She froze, heart pounding. Then she heard the occupant by the hearth shift, letting out a grunt. Silence. After a moment, the man resumed snoring softly. Arya exhaled in relief. She pushed the door open. The interior was dim, lit only by the dying embers in the hearth. She slipped inside, dagger in hand, barefoot to keep silent. The man asleep by the fire wore a threadbare cloak. He looked road-weary, mouth hanging open. She bypassed him easily, heading for the small side room. The Hound's door was partly ajar, letting out a sliver of flickering lantern light. She peered inside. The room was cramped, with a straw pallet on the floor and a table holding a lantern. The Hound sat on the edge of the pallet, back turned to the door, rubbing his scarred neck. His sword lay within arm's reach. He hadn't removed his boots, as if he too was always prepared for danger. Arya stepped in. The floor creaked. He froze, muscles tensing. In an instant, he snatched his sword. "Who's there?" he growled, half rising. She advanced, dagger at the ready. The lantern light revealed her face, a mask, but shaped like the face she had as a young woman, the face that was a more mature version of Arya Stark. She had chosen it deliberately, not the childish features he'd known, but close enough that if he looked carefully, he might see the ghost of the girl he remembered. His one good eye narrowed. He recognized something, some intangible tilt of her head or glint in her gaze. "What the?" he muttered, confusion twisting his scarred features. She took another step forward, blade raised. For a moment, it was as though time folded in on itself, recalling the day she had left him bleeding on the mountainside. His eyes flicked to her dagger. "You?" he said, voice low and hoarse. Arya said nothing. She waited, letting him see the intent in her posture. He bared his teeth in a grimace, half a snarl, half a bitter laugh. "Guess you came to finish it, then?" The anger in his voice was tinged with resignation. He hefted his sword, but did not raise it to strike. "You should have done it then, girl. Would have saved me some pain." She almost wanted to say, "I'm not a girl anymore. I'm no one," but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she drew closer, the dagger trembling in her grip. Did her hand actually shake? Perhaps the assassin's calm was faltering, just for an instant. She recalled the many nights traveling with him, the things he had taught her, how to gut a rabbit, how to sense an ambush, how he had once saved her life from those who would harm her. She remembered the hatred, but she also remembered a strange kind of protectiveness. He watched her carefully. "You always had a list. Do you still keep it?" He let out a derisive snort. "My name was on it. I remember. I told you to go on, say my name. I deserved it, I suppose." He lowered the sword slightly. "But I'm not the man I was. Done some good here and there, not that it likely matters to you." Arya could feel a roiling inside her chest. Here he was wounded, scarred, tired. The Hound was a ghost of what he'd once been. She had killed every name that once haunted her. Everyone who wronged her family was dust. She had crossed them off one by one. And this man, too, had a debt. "You killed Micah," she said softly, the voice tinted with the memory of the frightened butcher's boy. She had not said that name in years. He nodded once, jaw clenched. I did." Silence. Arya raised the dagger to his throat, the same position she had used on Cersei. This kill should be easy, but her hand hesitated. In that moment, she realized that in all her kills, there had been no personal conflict. Her targets were wholly and entirely her enemies. Even in the Red Wedding revenge, Walder Frey was a monster to her. Cersei was the reason her family had been destroyed. But Sandor Clegane? He was complicated. He was cruel but also kind in a twisted way. He had been her tormentor and her protector. She had felt fury and a strange empathy toward him. He closed his eyes, as though waiting for the blade. "Do it," he muttered. "You've come this far. I won't beg. The world's gone mad anyway." She stared at him, hearing the crackle of the lantern, feeling the chill draft through the cracks in the walls. Something in her chest tightened. She had sworn an oath to kill him, but if the many-faced god demanded death, wouldn't she feel the same cold clarity as always? Why did her hand quake? Why did she remember how he'd carried her when she was too weak to walk, or how he'd once told her the truth about her mother's death? No matter how harsh, she thought of the House of Black and White, of the vow that a faceless assassin was no one. And then she thought of her father, who had always believed in justice, but also in mercy. Ned Stark, who had taught her how to hold a sword, who had told her that the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword, and should do so with the knowledge of why. If she killed the Hound now, would that be justice or just vengeance? Her hand lowered. She could see the tension drain from him. He opened his good eye slowly, reading her face, confusion etched in every line. She took a step back, then another. He let out a breath. No victory in it, just weary relief. In a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He's off the list." She wasn't sure if she meant it, or if she was rewriting the list in that very moment. But she sheathed the dagger, heart pounding as if she had just fought the mountain again. The Hound watched her, stunned into silence. The burn scars on his face twisted with conflicting emotion. They stood like that for a long moment, two battered souls bound by blood and fate. Then she turned on her heel and slipped out the door. She took the corridor in silent strides, past the sleeping man by the hearth, out into the night. The Hound did not follow. Outside, the sky was moonless, cold. She walked away from the farmhouse, the grass whispering under her boots, the dagger still warm against her side. She could have done it. She had wanted to do it once. The vow had driven her for so long. Yet in that final instant, she realized she had changed. She was no longer that girl chanting names in the darkness. In the end, she had chosen to let go. Perhaps that was the last vestige of Arya Stark, or perhaps it was the many-faced god acknowledging that Sandor Clegane's debt had already been paid in other ways. She did not know, but the decision felt irrevocable. She did not look back. She traveled westward, eventually finding her horse at the small glade where she'd hidden him. As she mounted, she let the hush of night settle over her, the crisp air biting at her cheeks. She had ended the reign of Cersei Lannister and destroyed the monstrous mountain. She had avenged the wrongs done to House Stark, as best she could. The last name on her list had been removed by her own will, not by the edge of her blade. She realized, with a start, that she felt strangely empty. The list that had guided her for so long, the nightly prayer that fueled her, was gone. She had always imagined she would feel triumph or satisfaction at its completion. Instead, she felt a hollow calm, as if an old wound had finally scarred over. Perhaps she was truly free now, or perhaps she had lost the one anchor that had carried her through years of hardship. There was a whole world out there beyond vengeance. Maybe she would continue north, return to Winterfell, see if any of her family remained, or if it was just ghosts. Maybe she would sail west of Westeros, as she had once dreamed. Maybe she would return to the House of Black and White, though she suspected that path was closed to her. She was no one and yet someone at the same time, a daughter of the North and a servant of the many-faced god. The future stretched before her in uncertain shades of gray. She nudged the horse forward, letting it pick a path through the dark. Far behind her, the bells of King's Landing had long since faded, leaving only the rustle of wind in the trees and the whisper of distant water. She had done what she came to do. Arya Stark had taken her vengeance. Now all that remained was the living of whatever life came next. She rode on, alone under the silent sky, a single faceless shadow passing through a land haunted by war and winter. No one saw her go. No one knew her name. And in that, at long last, there was a strange and bittersweet peace. Though she no longer chanted her list, the names hovered like ghosts at the periphery of her thoughts. Walder Frey, Meryn Trant, Eileen Payne, Cersei Lannister, Gregor Clegane. Felt strange to ride without that nightly litany. And yet, this silence in her mind was new and unsettling, as if she'd lost a companion who had traveled with her all these years. Her vengeance was complete. At least the final name she cared to honor had been crossed out. The rest had died through circumstances beyond her. Time and fate had reduced the remainder until none truly mattered. Even Sandor Clegane, the Hound, was off her list, though he still drew breath. Perhaps he had earned his reprieve by suffering the entire world's cruelties in turn. Perhaps she had changed enough to grant him mercy. In truth, she did not know which it was, only that she had not been able to kill him. At a small stream, she dismounted to let her mare drink. The water reflected faint starlight, a dark silver mirror that shuddered with every ripple. The mare's breath sent clouds of vapor into the night air as she drank. Arya, though she no longer entirely thought of herself by that name, looked up at the scattered stars, recalling the stories of the old gods, the seven, the many-faced god, and of prophecies whispered in the dark. She wondered which ones, if any, held truth now that the wars had come and gone and so much had changed. She felt an ache in her legs and realized she had been riding almost without pause since she left the Hound's makeshift camp. She had forced herself onward, half fearing she might turn back if she rested. But there was no going back. The Hound belonged to another life. She gave him her silence, her decision. That was all. At length, she watered the horse, drank a few swallows herself, and led the mare away. She pressed on by moonlight, finding a patch of stunted pines to shelter in when her eyes grew too heavy to continue. She tethered her horse in the lee of the trees, built a small fire of fallen branches, and huddled beside it, crossing her arms over her chest. The flames crackled low, sending sparks into the cold air. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by memories that no longer had a shape. She dreamed of her father, her mother, of Ned Stark's calm face telling her to look, telling her to see. But in the dream, the figures dissolved into the darkness the moment she tried to speak. She woke at dawn with a stiff neck and a thin layer of frost on her cloak. The sky was as pale as unspun wool, the sun a faint smear of light behind thick clouds. She gathered her belongings, doused the embers, and rode on. She had told herself she might head north to Winterfell, but she had not truly decided. Her mind resisted. Could she return to the place she had loved as a child, now that she was no longer that child? Was the castle even standing? Word was that Sansa had taken up rule or had done so at some point, but the realm was in constant flux. Jon was king in the north, or perhaps no longer. She had heard so many conflicting rumors. Or maybe Bran was there or Rickon's ghost. She did not know. She scarcely trusted rumor, so she let the road guide her, trusting her own instincts. Days blurred together, a mosaic of half-empty villages and muddy roads. Soldiers roamed in small companies, wearing various sigils that she only half recognized, like a realm still picking itself apart in the aftermath of war. She avoided them all, using the many faces that lived in her pack. A traveling peddler with salt and pepper whiskers, a sweet-faced girl with short-cropped hair, a widow in black. She had so many to choose from, each mask a precise arrangement of leather and magic, each one a new persona. It was second nature now, though she felt no particular joy in it. It was simply how she stayed free. Her path eventually led her to a once prosperous market town near the banks of the Trident. She recognized the shape of its walls from childhood journeys, though war had battered them. Burn marks blackened the gate, and the battlements were crudely patched. She adopted the face of a middle-aged craftsman, an unremarkable man with sun-browned skin and a limp. She'd perfected his gait long ago, and she used a sturdy walking stick to sell the illusion. As she approached the gate, guards eyed her wearily, but one jerked a thumb to the side. "Move along," he muttered. "No trouble. We've got enough hungry folk here already." She nodded silently, hunching her shoulders in a submissive gesture, and entered. The town's main street was muddy, flanked by timber-framed buildings in various states of disrepair. A few stalls sold onions, turnips, and watery beer. Children with hollow cheeks darted around, begging for scraps. Some of the older folk glared suspiciously at passers-by, as if any new face could be a threat. She found a small stable behind an inn and paid the stable hand 2 copper coins to house her mare for the night, offering no more than a grunt of thanks. The stable hand, used to travelers far less polite, did not question it. Inside, the inn's common room was cramped and smoky. A few men hunched over their ale, mumbling in low tones. A woman stirred a pot of stew that smelled mostly of cabbage and onion. Arya took a seat in the corner, adjusting her craftsman's mask to ensure the edges were concealed by the hood of her drab cloak. She ordered a small bowl of stew and a cup of small beer. The innkeep glanced at her limp and said nothing else. War had taught people to mind their own business. Over the rim of her cup, she listened. Fragments of conversation drifted to her. Talk of King's Landing in uproar since the Queen's murder, talk of the Iron Throne's future. Some claimed Daenerys Targaryen would surely seize it. Others said the city had half rebelled at the memory of Dragonfire. Someone whispered that the new hand was trying to hold the capital together, but no one knew who that hand might be. Some said Tyrion Lannister still lived, an outcast who might return to claim it all. Others said Gendry Baratheon had a possible claim. And swirling through it all, the rumor. A faceless killer had slain Cersei in her own solar, a phantom that overcame even the dreaded mountain. "Devil's work, that," an old woman murmured at the next table. "They say the mountain bled black, poison in his veins. No night's a match for dark magic." Arya sipped her beer, unmoved by the speculation. She knew the truth of it, and that was enough. She let the talk wash over her like a river's current, gleaning what might be useful. With Cersei gone, King's Landing tottered on a knife's edge. The wars might flare anew, or some uneasy council might arise. For now, the realm was stuck in limbo. And the North? She heard little mention of its governance, only that the Starks remained strong. It stirred something in her chest, some echo of pride or longing, but she kept her face impassive. She finished her meal in silence, dropped a few copper coins on the table, and retreated to a small, drafty room the innkeep provided. There, she lay on a straw pallet, half listening to the chatter below. She considered leaving at first light, continuing north. Maybe she would set eyes on Winterfell again. Part of her yearned for that, but another part was afraid, as if crossing those gates would be an admission of something irrevocable. She could so easily be no one, and yet the name Arya Stark beckoned like a memory of spring in a winter-locked land. She had dreamt for years of returning to Winterfell in triumph, crossing her enemies' names from her list, having her family greet her with open arms. But her mother and father were gone, robbed too, all lost. Bran was rumored to possess strange powers of the old gods. Rickon, she had once heard, died at the hands of House Bolton. Sansa was a queen or had been or was at least a ruler in all but name. Jon had gone beyond the wall or had gone to the south. Stories conflicted. Arya was not even sure he lived. If she returned, what would she even say? Would her sister know her? Would there be a place for a faceless assassin among the newly rebuilt House Stark? The questions circled her mind like ravens around a field of corpses. Eventually, she slept, though fitfully. Before the first hints of dawn, she rose, changed her face to that of a weary young woman with braided hair, and left the inn without a word. She saddled her mare quickly, ignoring the stable hand's bleary greeting, and rode out through the gate, unnoticed in the pre-dawn gloom. North. She told herself that if she was going anywhere, it might as well be the path she'd once known. The roads worsened as she set on. Signs of chaos increased. She passed scorched farms, villages empty but for crows, skeletal remains of what might have been men or beasts. Even so, winter was easing its grip, or so it felt. The days were lengthening. The snows that blanketed the terrain further north would be deeper, but down here the freeze was starting to recede. Ragged survivors of so many battles trudged the roads, scavenging or seeking shelter behind crumbling walls. She kept her distance from them, occasionally flicking a glance their way. Some offered her frightened looks, as if every stranger might be a brigand. Others simply stared with hollow resignation. She tried not to wonder if any recognized her from years past. She had grown taller, leaner, but the eyes of the starving can be sharp, especially if they sense opportunity. She made sure to be just another face, another shape in the gloom, never lingering. On the third evening after leaving the market town, she came upon a small group of travelers huddled around a dying campfire near a copse of willow trees. She might have skirted them entirely, but her horse was spent, and the night looked bitterly cold. She approached slowly, letting her hood conceal her face. 3 figures glanced up warily. An older man in a patched cloak, a youth clutching a wooden staff, and a woman with a thick shawl. They looked impoverished but not armed for trouble. "Evening," Arya murmured. She pitched her voice low, adopting a nondescript accent. "May I share the fire?" The woman hesitated, then gestured stiffly. "Long as you got nothing to steal." Her tone was resigned. She clutched the shawl around her shoulders. "We're just heading west, away from all the troubles." "Thank you." Arya dismounted. She had a small pouch of stale bread and strips of dried meat. They eyed it hungrily. She tore a piece and offered it wordlessly, hoping to ease their suspicions. The older man accepted it with a nod, passing some to the woman and the youth. Their expressions softened a fraction. They warmed themselves around the fire in silence. The wind rustled the willow branches, and the night smelled of damp earth. The youth, perhaps 15, looked at Arya's horse with a wistful curiosity. "We had one once," he murmured. "Sold it for a bit of coin. Didn't help much." Arya only nodded, not wanting to give away details of her own. She dipped her head so that the hood cast her face in deeper shadow. The older man let out a sigh. "You from the south?" "Could be." She deflected, ripping a strip of meat with her teeth. She had learned to discourage conversation by being vague. But the man continued anyway. "Terrible business in the south. War after war. Never ends. Rumor has it the queen was murdered. Throat slit by some sorcerer or demon with no face. The city's in chaos now, they say. Maybe a new king's crowned, maybe no one's crowned. Who can keep up?" Arya made a small sound that could have been agreement or disinterest. The woman, long matted hair framing a face lined with hardship, shook her head. "The dead keep piling up while us small folk starve. We used to live near Riverrun. Gone now. Lord Edmure tried to keep it all together. But the phrase, well, we all know how that ended." She paused, a haunted look in her eyes. "I hear the phrase got their due. Some say a she-wolf of the north came down on them. Others say it was black magic. I suppose it's all the same to us." Arya found herself studying the woman in the flickering firelight. A she-wolf of the north. It stirred something deep within, a pride or a sorrow. She couldn't tell. She bit her lip, forcing herself to remain impassive. After a moment, she offered a small shrug, as though none of it mattered to her. "The realm is full of stories," she said. "Hard to know which are true." The youth muttered, "Don't matter if they're true. All that matters is we find some safe place to live." He stared into the flames, bitterness etched into his young face. "Maybe the north is better off if those stories about the undead are done. My father fought in that war. Never came back." The older man coughed quietly. "The north might be safer now. Some say the Boltons are gone, and Winterfell stands once more under the Starks. There's talk of them forging alliances with what's left of the Vale, or maybe with the Targaryen queen. All rumor, though. We can't be sure. Is that where you're headed? Arya asked softly, letting just enough curiosity show. The man sighed. No, we're turning west, hoping to find farmland that hasn't been burned. Maybe the Ironborn aren't prowling the coasts anymore. Maybe we can find a patch to farm. We're too old to keep running all our lives. Arya nodded. She felt a flicker of sympathy for these three, battered by a realm's turmoil they never caused. This was the cost of all the wars, the petty squabbles of lords, the thirst for vengeance she herself had once embodied. In her mind's eye, she saw her old self, chanting the names of those who had wronged her, certain that striking them off would bring some cosmic justice. But the land still bled, the small folk still suffered. Cersei's death changed little for these people. The blow that she had once believed to be so monumental was just another piece of the never-ending strife. It did not fill her with regret, exactly, but it pried open the hollowness in her chest. Perhaps that was the price of becoming no one. The night passed slowly. She dozed with her back to the horse, a dagger tucked under her cloak in case any trouble stirred. But none came. By morning's first light, she roused, nodded a wordless farewell to the three travelers, and continued onward. She left them a small scrap of dried meat by their packs, unannounced. Then she urged her mare north, always north. The days merged, each a gray stretch of muddy trails, bare trees, and the occasional outpost where she might trade for supplies. She rarely lingered in one face too long, lest any watchful eyes notice. Sometimes, she pulled her cloak around her so tightly that no one even caught a glimpse of her features. The roads were emptier now, the villages more scarce. Signs of old battles were starker. Collapsed towers, arrow-pocked walls, farmland that had reverted to wild brush. Yet the further she went, the more she felt the crisp tang in the air that whispered of home. Every time a northern pine loomed above the road, or a gust carried the faint scent of snow, her heart twisted. She found herself thinking of Jon more often than she liked. If rumors held any truth, he had once joined forces with Daenerys Targaryen to defeat the threat of the White Walkers. Or so the bards sang, weaving tales of heroic battles at the Wall and beyond. Then she heard conflicting accounts. That the Dragon Queen had marched south and wrought destruction upon the city. That Jon might have turned on her or she on him. The stories were so tangled she hardly knew what to believe. Sansa, likewise, drifted through rumor. Some said she was Lady of Winterfell. Others said she was Queen of the independent North. Perhaps Arya would find out for herself. She rode into the reddening sunset one evening and found herself crossing into lands more familiar. Craggy hills and thick pine forests reminiscent of her earliest memories. Here, the nights grew colder, the wind sharper. Occasionally, she saw shapes among the trees at twilight. Wolves, or perhaps only the shadows of them, gliding between trunks. Once, she thought she spotted a great she-wolf far in the distance, large enough to be mistaken for a small horse. A memory tugged at her. Nymeria? No, that was impossible. She had lost her dire wolf so many years ago. But for a moment, she dared wonder if that bond lingered, if her old friend roamed these lands still. The shape vanished almost as soon as she noticed it, leaving her with a pang of longing. As she pressed on, she encountered more traces of the North's defenses. A large band of armed men, each bearing the direwolf sigil, was camped along a ridgeline. She watched them from a safe distance, hidden by the undergrowth. They seemed organized, well-fed, and none wore the gaudy colors of the southern houses. Their captain, a tall woman with a stern bearing, patrolled the perimeter. Arya recognized that discipline. These were likely loyal to House Stark, or at least loyal to the new northern regime. Something like pride fluttered inside her, though she did not approach. She circled around their camp carefully, crossing the ridge at a more remote spot. Twice, she had to hide under a fallen log to avoid passing patrols. She did not fear them exactly, but she was not ready to reveal herself. She wanted to see Winterfell on her own terms, without fanfare, without the risk of betrayal or confusion. Her heart pounded in her chest as she imagined stepping onto the drawbridge of her old home. What if it was unrecognizable? What if Sansa refused to trust her? Her mind churned, but she pushed it aside. She had no illusions about forging a warm family reunion. She only needed to see to know. Another day passed, and at last, she crested a gentle slope that opened onto the wide plains south of Winterfell. Snow crusted the grass in patches, but it was not deep. The sky was a steel-gray dome, and crows dotted the fields. In the far distance, she glimpsed the tall towers of Winterfell's walls, the familiar silhouettes that had once been part of her daily life. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, a sign that it was inhabited, thriving. The castle stood proud amid the cold landscape, its walls repaired from the ruin she had once feared. She reined in her horse, her breath catching. Even from miles away, the sight of those walls tugged at something deep in her chest. Home. But was it, after all, she had become? She decided to approach at dusk, under the cloak of semi-darkness. That would let her watch from a distance, gauge the changes, perhaps slip inside unseen. She watered her horse at a half-frozen creek, then tethered it in a hollow. The mare nickered softly, as if questioning this new delay. Arya patted her flank and moved on foot for the last league, keeping to the edges of fields, crouching behind low stone walls. Winterfell looked different up close. The ramparts had been rebuilt with fresh stone, and new timbers formed a defensive outer palisade. The gates bristled with guards wearing cloaks of thick wool dyed stark gray. Banners with the direwolf sigil stirred in the wind, a solemn testament to House Stark's continued presence. Torches lit the ramparts, and she heard the clang of steel in the courtyard. Perhaps sword practice or blacksmiths at work. Felt alive, secure. Her heart pounded. Part of her wanted to walk straight to the gates and announce herself, see who came to greet her. But the assassin in her recoiled from that. She needed more information first. She needed to know who ruled, what the atmosphere was. She circled the walls, looking for vulnerabilities. She knew Winterfell's labyrinth of courtyards, towers, and hidden passages. At least, she knew them as they were when she was a girl. Some things might have changed, but she suspected the underlying bones remained the same. She slipped into a narrow trench near an outbuilding at the southwestern corner, where the moat had once begun. The water there was mostly frozen, only a thin trickle running beneath the ice. A postern gate used to be located here, a small door for huntsmen or the occasional stealthy exit. She found it, newly reinforced with iron, but the door's frame was old. She tested the latch, locked from within. She felt along the edges for weaknesses. If she had her lockpicks and enough time, she might manage to slip inside. Night fell fully, the sky empty of moon or stars. Clouds thickened. A biting wind carried the promise of more snow. She heard the crunch of boots overhead, a guard patrolling the top of the wall. She pressed herself against the stone, breath held. The guard's footsteps passed, fading into the distance. She exhaled. This was a dangerous approach, but she had chosen it. So, she pulled her picks from a hidden pocket in her belt and got to work on the postern door's lock. Carefully, with deft movements, she probed the mechanism. A year ago, in Bravos, she had practiced on more intricate locks under the watchful eye of a master burglar who sometimes resided at the House of Black and White. This simpler contraption clicked after a few attempts, and she felt the bar shift. She smiled grimly to herself. Easing the door open, she slipped into a narrow corridor. Darkness greeted her. The stone walls were cold and smelled faintly of damp straw and old earth, but she recognized the architecture, the slight slope of the floor. This was an old service tunnel that led toward the kennels, if memory served. She paused, listening for any sign of watchers. When she heard nothing, she glided forward, steps silent, her hood drawn low. A single torch flickered at the far bend, revealing a small antechamber stacked with barrels, probably ale or grain. She pressed herself behind the barrels when she heard footsteps approach. A burly man in a stark livery emerged from a side door, carrying a ledger and muttering under his breath. He paused to jot something down, then left. Arya watched him go, noticing that he was neither heavily armed nor alert for intruders. Security must have grown lax in the lesser-used corridors, or else they simply hadn't anticipated infiltration from the southwestern postern. She moved on, finding a narrow staircase that rose toward the courtyard. When she reached the top, she peered out through a crack in the door. The courtyard lay beyond, a wide expanse of cobblestones lit by torches. Guards patrolled in pairs, and stable boys bustled about with blankets for the horses. The old well sat near the center, the steam from the hot springs swirling around the edges. She recognized the stables on one side, the armory on the other. A wave of memory washed over her. She could almost see herself as a child, practicing archery with her brothers while their father looked on. The ghosts lingered everywhere, etched into every stone. It made her chest ache. She drew back. Her mission was only to observe, or so she told herself. She had no illusions about a grand reunion. Stealthily, she climbed another set of stairs that led to a walkway overlooking the courtyard. She knew that if she crawled along the shadows, she might reach the ramparts. From there, perhaps she could find a vantage point to see into the Great Hall or the keep's main corridors. Yes, that was the next step. She moved carefully, hugging the walls, ducking into the gloom whenever a guard passed below. Winterfell was large, and even with new construction, many corners remained dark and unguarded at night. Eventually, she came to a rampart walk. The wind cut at her, carrying flakes of snow. She crouched behind the crenellations and peeked over. The great hall's long roof rose below her, windows glowing with golden light. If she looked sharply enough, she could see inside through the high windows. She took a few more steps along the rampart, scanning. Then she found a place where a lower roof connected to a tower. She lowered herself, dropping quietly onto that roof. It was slick with snow, and she scrambled for purchase. Once steady, she crawled on hands and knees to the nearest window. Inside the hall, she saw a gathering of northern lords and ladies, some standing by the fire, others seated at the long tables. At the high table, a woman with auburn hair sat in a carved chair draped with white fur. Sansa. Her sister's face was more refined now, older, though touched with the same beauty that had once graced their mother. Her posture was regal, calm, a slight crease between her brows as she listened to a tall man in a leather jerkin. Two banners flanked Sansa's seat, the Stark direwolf and another she did not recognize. Perhaps a personal sigil or one denoting the North's new alliances. Arya's breath caught. She could see the weight of responsibility on Sansa's features. This was not the frightened girl who once dreamt of golden nights and southern tournaments. This was a ruler, a woman who had survived as many horrors as Arya in her own way. She looked strong, though the flicker of tiredness behind her eyes was unmistakable. Arya watched as Sansa rose to speak, though the words were muffled by the thick glass. Sansa made a few measured gestures, and the tall man nodded. Then Sansa sank back into her seat, smiling faintly at a grizzled lord who clapped his hands in approval. The hall erupted into a toast. Tankards raised. Sansa did not join in fully. She offered only a small lift of her cup, but the corners of her mouth turned upward. Her eyes glimmered with steeled resolve and a hint of pride. Arya felt a surge of emotion she could barely name. She had worried that her sister would be overshadowed by all that had happened. Yet here she was, seemingly presiding over a council that respected her. A wave of warmth washed through Arya's chest, mingled with envy, sorrow, relief. She was proud that a Stark still held Winterfell, and yet, she was an outsider, peering in from the cold. She lingered at that window ledge a long time, half frozen, just to watch Sansa speak. She studied her sister's mannerisms, the calm tilt of her head, the subtle gestures that commanded attention. Sansa had grown into a formidable presence, a far cry from the naive girl who once scolded Arya for her rough ways. Arya felt a pang of regret that she had not been here to share in Sansa's trials, to protect her when she was alone among the vipers of King's Landing. But those days were gone, and the woman inside the hall seemed more than capable of protecting herself. Eventually, a pair of guards approached the dais, exchanging a few words with Sansa. She stood, nodded to the lords, and left the hall through a side door. The rest of the gathering began dispersing. Candles were snuffed, benches scraped back. Arya felt her limbs trembling from the cold. She retreated from the window, carefully retraced her steps across the roof, and climbed back to the ramparts. A fresh gust of wind whipped her cloak. She crouched behind the stone battlements, her thoughts churning. Sansa had the look of a queen, or at least a lady of great authority. If she had that, then likely she had loyal advisors and watchers. Arya's quiet infiltration might not remain secret for long if she lingered. She considered going to Sansa in private, revealing herself. But the memory of how it felt to confront the Hound weighed upon her. The memory of stepping into that farmhouse and seeing old ghosts in new flesh. Would Sansa welcome her, or would she see only a changed creature, more assassin than sister? Arya exhaled slowly. Perhaps she should attempt to speak with Sansa. Perhaps she should slip away, leaving them to their peace. Yet something told her that if she left now, she might never return. And the idea of turning away from Winterfell again left a hollow pit in her. Quietly, she made her way back through the corridors, avoiding guards with practiced ease. She felt the old familiarity of these halls beneath her fingers, a memory of scuffing her knees as a child, chasing cats, or practicing with a bow. The castle had changed, but also not. Shadows clung to old corners. The hot springs still warmed certain passages, leaving an odd mist. She reached the corridor leading to the main keep, where she suspected Sansa's quarters lay. 2 guards stood outside a large door, stifling yawns in the torchlight. They wore the stark sigil, swords belted at their waists. Arya ducked back around a corner. If Sansa was truly the Lady of Winterfell, that door might lead to her private solar or bedchamber. Arya wondered if she could slip in without being noticed, but the presence of guards complicated that plan. She could incapacitate them, but that might lead to dangerous misunderstandings. Alternatively, she could find a face that belonged here. A maid, perhaps, but forging or stealing a face would require more time and risk. She hovered in the shadows, torn. Then the door opened. Sansa emerged, speaking in hushed tones with a third guard, a woman clad in fur-trimmed armor. "Very well," Sansa was saying. "Keep me informed. I'll speak with Lord Serwyn at dawn." The guard nodded and strode away, leaving Sansa with the 2 by the door. She looked tired but resolute. Her hair was pinned up in a neat coil, the auburn color glowing in the torchlight. She paused a moment to rub her temple, as if fighting off a headache. One of the guards asked a question. Sansa shook her head. "No, I won't need anything else tonight." Arya felt her pulse quicken. She could sense an opportunity, though she wasn't entirely sure what form it would take. If she wanted a private moment with Sansa, perhaps she could lure her away from the guards. Or maybe she could wait until Sansa had retired, then slip inside. But that carried risks. She clenched her jaw, uncertain. Fate interceded. Another guard came rushing down the corridor from the opposite direction, calling Sansa's name. He carried a parchment in one hand and looked anxious. Sansa signaled for him to speak. He skidded to a stop, saluted clumsily, and said something in a low voice. Arya caught only the phrase "urgent news" and "southern border." Sansa frowned, beckoning the guard into the room she'd just left. The 2 stationed outside followed her in. The heavy door closed with a thud. Arya was left alone in the corridor, heart thumping. She had no illusions about eavesdropping successfully if the door was barred. But a memory sparked. There was a narrow servant's passage behind that particular chamber, a route that once allowed discreet service of meals or cleaning. If it was still there, if it was not blocked or collapsed, she might overhear. Or more. She recalled the route from her childhood explorations. Without hesitation, she set off through the winding back passage. She found a small wooden door half hidden by a tapestry of a hunting scene. Tugging on the metal ring, she was relieved to see it yield, squeaking softly. Inside lay a cramped space, dark and musty, barely wide enough for her shoulders. She groped forward, letting her hand slide along the cold stone. The corridor turned, then narrowed further as it ran behind the chamber walls. Faint light filtered through slender gaps, spy holes once used by servants to monitor guests' needs. She inched carefully, crouching. Her foot dislodged a small stone, sending it clattering. She froze, breath caught, but no alarm sounded from the other side of the wall. Swallowing, she continued until she found a spot where a thin vertical slit looked into the room. She pressed her eye to it. Sansa stood near a table with the guard who had delivered the parchment. The two others flanked the door. By the shape of the room, Arya guessed it was Sansa's solar or office, not her bedchamber. Tapestries of dire wolves and weirwoods adorned the walls. A small fire crackled in a nearby hearth, casting flickering shadows. Sansa's expression was unreadable as she scanned the parchment. At last, she set it down, folding her hands on the table. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice calm but charged with tension. The guard cleared his throat. "My lady, reports from our outriders near Moat Cailin indicate that a southern force approached, perhaps intending to parley. They carried no clear sigil, only white banners. We suspect they might be loyalists to the Targaryen cause, or perhaps Sellswords seeking safe passage. Their leader claimed they come with an offer, though we can't be certain." One of the guards by the door scowled. "Seems risky. Why not come under a recognized banner if they want peace?" Sansa's gaze flickered. "Or a trap. The realm is in turmoil since news of the Queen's murder reached every corner. Perhaps factions sense an opportunity to carve out power. Still, the North remains separate. We must tread carefully." Arya noted the subtle shift in Sansa's posture. Composed, but not unfeeling. She was thinking, weighing possibilities. "We can't afford open conflict again," Sansa went on. "Not after the winter and the wars. We must at least hear them out. Dispatch a raven to them. They are to remain outside Moat Cailin's perimeter until I send a diplomatic escort. If they refuse, we'll treat them as hostiles." The guard nodded. "Aye, my lady. Should we call the bannermen?" Sansa sighed softly. "Not yet. Let us be certain of their intentions. I won't summon half the North for a group that may only number a few dozen. But keep our outriders vigilant. If these Southerners are more than they claim, we need fair warning." She pushed the parchment aside. "Go now, make it so." The guard bowed and left. Sansa remained, arms crossed, staring at the closed door. The two guards who'd originally accompanied her shifted, unsure whether to stay. Sansa waved a hand. "You can go as well. I'd like some privacy." They hesitated, exchanging a glance. Finally, they bowed in unison and exited. Sansa stood alone in the chamber. Arya pressed her ear closer to the spy hole, trying to hear if Sansa muttered anything under her breath. But her sister only closed her eyes, exhaled, and then walked toward the hearth. A look of weariness crossed her face. She sank into a tall-backed chair, resting her forehead against her hand. Arya felt a surge of sympathy and longing. She wanted to step out, to kneel before Sansa as a sister might, to speak her name. But fear held her rooted. How would Sansa react? Would she see a ghost or a monster? Would she trust that Arya's loyalty still lay with House Stark after everything she had become? She told herself she should turn away, that she was intruding on a life that no longer needed her. Yet something in Sansa's posture, a certain weight, a lonely stoop of her shoulders, pulled at Arya more powerfully than any vow. Carefully, she inched along the corridor, searching for a hidden latch that might open into the solar. Servants' passages often had discreet doors. Her fingers traced the stone until she found a small ridge. She pressed it gently, feeling a panel give way. Candlelight seeped into the passage. Yes, there was a door. She could open it if she dared. Her heartbeat thundered. She told herself she might only watch from here, glean some sense of Sansa's life, then slip away. But an impulse flared inside her, a desire to step forward. After all she had endured, after crossing the world in pursuit of revenge, after letting the Hound live, she found she wanted to see her sister. She wanted that final bit of closure, to know if she could be Arya Stark again, even for a moment. She pressed the latch. The panel swung open with a faint creak. Sansa looked up, startled. Her hand went to the dagger at her belt. She had clearly learned to protect herself. Her eyes darted toward the opening. Arya stepped through, hood low, face half-shadowed. Her hands raised slightly to show she meant no harm. Sansa stood. "Who?" she began, voice taut. "How did you?" Arya let her hood fall. She wore no mask at this moment, only the face that was closest to her natural one, though older and with sharper angles. Her hair was dark, cropped near her shoulders, and her gray eyes carried the weight of many miles. For a moment, Sansa stared, confusion warring with recognition. Then her lips parted, and she let out a faint gasp. "Arya!" Arya swallowed, her throat tight as if it had seized up. She took a step forward, uncertain. "It's me," she whispered, though her voice did not sound like the child she once was. Sansa's eyes brimmed with a swirl of emotions. Shock, relief, doubt, perhaps even fear. She took a halting step forward, as if to confirm Arya was not some apparition. Her gaze flicked over Arya's leathers, the slender dagger at her hip, the lines in her face that no longer belonged to a girl. "Arya," she breathed again, more quietly, her voice cracking. "We thought you might be, or that you might never return." She hesitated, tears threatening. "Are you truly here, or is this another dream?" Arya exhaled, a trembling smile ghosting her lips. She felt unsteady, as if the floor might drop from beneath her. "I'm here," she managed. "I came back. She stopped, uncertain how to explain all that had happened, all the time and distance. Instead, she said the one thing that felt safe. "I saw you in the hall. You look well." A tear slid down Sansa's cheek, but she brushed it aside quickly, composure returning. "I never expected. You look so different." Her voice wavered, but she tried to stand tall, like the Lady of Winterfell she had become. "Where have you been? How?" She broke off again, at a loss for words. They stood there a moment in a hush broken only by the crackling fire. Arya dared to look into Sansa's eyes and saw not just her sister, but a leader tempered by countless ordeals. She knew her own eyes likely carried a similar weight. They were no longer children, no longer the petty siblings who bickered over needlework and archery. Sansa found her voice again. I'm so glad you're alive," she whispered. And in those words, Arya sensed the raw sincerity that lay beneath all the layers of duty and caution. Sansa reached out a trembling hand as if to touch Arya's cheek. Arya let her, standing still as her sister's palm rested gently against her face. It felt surreal, an echo of a life long gone. A wave of emotion rose in her chest, threatening to choke her. For an instant, she was that young girl whose world had fractured in King's Landing, who had lost her father, her mother, her siblings, who had run ragged across the war-torn realm. Everything she'd done since then had been for survival or vengeance. Now, for the first time, she felt the bloom of something else. The possibility that she could be a sister again, a daughter of House Stark. Tears glistened in Sansa's eyes. Arya swallowed hard, feeling her own tears rising. She had not wept in so long. But the next words tumbled out. Raw. "I'm sorry. I should have come sooner. There were things I had to do." The old impulses warred with the new. She wanted to tell Sansa of the faces, the kills, the list. But how could she speak that burden? Sansa's hand dropped, but she did not step away. She studied Arya's eyes, seeming to notice the flicker of guilt. "Things you don't have to say. Not yet. You're here now." She closed her eyes briefly, took a breath. "Will you stay?" Arya gazed at her sister. Every instinct told her to resist ties, to slip away before the entanglements of love and memory weakened her. Yet she wanted to stay, if only for a time. She nodded slowly, unsure how to shape the words. If you'll have me," she whispered at last. "I'm not the girl you remember." Sansa's lips curved in a sad smile. "None of us are who we were," she said quietly. "But you're still my sister." She paused, then added, "I won't force you. If you need to leave, I'll understand. But I'd like you to stay, Arya." Her name on Sansa's lips felt both comforting and foreign. She had lived so long as no one that hearing Arya, spoken by a loved one, was almost disorienting. She forced a shaky breath. "I'll stay for a while. She took a step back, glancing at the door. "I slipped in without permission. Your guards." Sansa actually let out a short, tremulous laugh, remembering perhaps Arya's old penchant for slipping around. "They'll be furious with themselves for missing an intruder, but I'll vouch for you, obviously." She studied Arya a moment longer, then said, "Let me call them in. Let them see you as my guest." Panic fluttered in Arya's gut. She recalled the nights in Bravos, the discipline of the House of Black and White, the secrecy. Yet Sansa's expression was gentle but firm. This was her domain. She had to set the tone for all those under her roof. Arya nodded, stepping aside. Sansa walked to the door, opened it, and summoned a pair of guards waiting in the corridor. They entered cautiously, hands on hilts, until they saw Sansa standing calmly beside the shadowy figure in the cloak. "This is my sister, Arya Stark," Sansa announced, voice steady. "She's come home. Spread the word that she's welcome in Winterfell. No one is to hinder her movements. Do you understand?" The guards gaped, exchanging astonished glances. One managed to stammer, "Why your sister, my lady? Of course. Forgive us for not recognizing." He trailed off, clearly flustered by the unexpected event. Sansa nodded, dismissing them. "Send a servant with hot water for a bath to the guest chambers adjoining mine," she added, "and have some food brought up. Arya, you'll stay there tonight if you wish. It's comfortable enough." Arya nodded, her throat tight. She felt exposed, uncertain of this sudden shift from secrecy to open acceptance. But Sansa's presence gave her a fragile sense of safety she hadn't felt in years. She allowed herself to follow Sansa out of the solar, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. The corridors seemed brighter now, each torch marking a path that might lead somewhere hopeful. Guards and servants turned to stare as they passed, rumor no doubt spreading at lightning speed. The lost Stark girl had returned. She kept her head down, ignoring the curious eyes, letting Sansa guide her. The keep's interior was warmed by the hot springs channeling steam through the walls, just as she remembered. They reached a modest but well-appointed set of chambers. Sansa paused outside the door, gesturing for Arya to enter. "This was once a guest suite, but it's rarely used now," Sansa said, pushing the door open. "Make yourself comfortable." Inside, a small hearth glowed with embers. A sturdy bed stood against one wall, and a table with chairs occupied the center. A tapestry of the old gods hung on one side, near a tall, narrow window. Arya stepped in, letting her gaze roam. It was far more welcoming than any place she'd slept in years. She felt awkwardly out of place, as if she were an imposter in this warm room. She set her travel pack on a bench, turning to Sansa. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other. Sansa looked as though she longed to ask 100 questions, about how Arya survived, what she'd done, why she was here now, but she held her tongue. Perhaps she sensed Arya's fragility, how easily she might spook and flee. Instead, Sansa gave a small, careful smile. "Rest," she said gently. "We'll speak in the morning." Arya nodded. She felt a rush of gratitude for Sansa's patience, for not demanding immediate explanations. She watched Sansa leave, closing the door softly behind her. Then Arya exhaled, looking around the chamber. Felt too quiet. She moved to the hearth, crouching to stir the embers until flames crackled anew. She shed her cloak, unbuckled the belt that held her dagger, and set it on the table. The old reflex to keep a weapon within arm's reach remained, so she placed it carefully, where she could grab it if needed. A few minutes later, a timid servant knocked, bringing a copper tub and buckets of hot water. Arya stepped aside, letting them fill it. The servant, an older woman with a kindly face, curtsied in flustered confusion at "My lady." Arya mumbled something non-committal. She was no lady, not anymore, but the woman seemed determined to treat her as one. Then the servant vanished, leaving Arya alone with the steaming bath. She hesitated, unaccustomed to such luxury. Still, the grime of the road clung to her, and the ache in her muscles beckoned. She shed her leathers, noticing the myriad scars that marred her arms and torso. Each told a story she did not wish to recount. She lowered herself into the hot water with a soft hiss of pain and pleasure. It had been so long since she'd felt warmth like this. Her eyes drifted shut, and for a few moments, she allowed her mind to float in the sensation. Memories swarmed unbidden. The house of black and white, the kindly man's lessons, the tension in King's Landing as she slit Cersei's throat, the black blood that oozed from the mountain's armor. She remembered the hush after the queen's last breath, the frantic escape, the echoes of bells tolling. Then she recalled the Hound's scarred face and her decision to spare him. A swirl of violence and survival. Now here she was, in Winterfell's guest chambers, soaking in hot water like a pampered noble. The contradictions of her life felt dizzying. When she emerged from the bath, the water had turned cloudy with dirt. She toweled off, rummaging through her pack for a clean shift. The best she could do was a simple linen tunic. She draped her cloak around her shoulders for warmth. She had no finery, no dresses. Part of her bristled at the idea of wearing one anyway. She brushed her hair with her fingers, glancing in a small mirror by the table. The face that looked back was still an echo of the stark features, albeit sharpened by hardship. A soft knock at the door. Arya tensed, reaching automatically for her dagger. "Yes," a voice answered, a muffled man's tone. "My lady, I've brought some supper. May I enter?" She hesitated, then slid the dagger into her belt just in case. "Come in." The door opened, revealing a young servant balancing a tray. He wore a tunic with the stark direwolf. He set the tray on the table, bowing low. The tray bore a steaming bowl of stew, rabbit by the smell, and a chunk of fresh bread. There was also a mug of mulled wine. Arya's stomach rumbled, and she realized she had eaten nothing since a meager midday bite. She nodded her thanks, dismissing him awkwardly with a wave. He bowed again and departed. Alone she ate. The stew was hot and savory, tasting of rosemary and thyme. She found herself devouring it faster than she intended, as if she were still on the road, uncertain when the next meal might come. The bread was soft, the mulled wine warming in her belly. Such simple comforts felt strange, almost taboo, after so long among the cold, the hungry, the terrified. Guilt and relief mingled, forming a knot in her throat. When she finished, she cleared the tray to a corner, not sure what else to do with it. The silence pressed in again. The bed beckoned, a real bed with thick blankets, but she eyed it warily. Could she truly sleep safely here? She touched her dagger's hilt, feeling the worn leather. Slowly, she approached the bed, pulling back the covers. The sheets were crisp and clean, smelling faintly of lavender. She thought of how many nights she'd spent curled under hedges, in barns, on the hard deck of ships. This felt alien. She slipped under the blanket fully clothed, dagger close at hand, and lay there, staring at the canopy overhead. She slept fitfully, dreams tugging her between the house of black and white and the old corridors of Winterfell. She saw Jaqen Hagar's inscrutable smile, and then she saw Sansa's face, tinged with sorrow. She dreamt of a direwolf prowling beyond her window, howling at a cold moon. She dreamt of her father's voice, telling her to find her pack. When she woke in the early hours, her face was damp with tears, though she couldn't remember why. Dawn arrived with the rumble of voices beyond her chamber door, the castle stirring to life. She washed quickly at the basin, then strapped on her leathers and dagger. She was uncertain how to present herself in the light of day. The revelations of the night might fade. Yet she resolved to see Sansa again, if only to confirm that this was real. She opened the door and found a servant waiting anxiously in the corridor, likely assigned to attend her. He jumped to attention. "Good morning, my lady. Lady Sansa asked that I bring you to breakfast in the Great Hall whenever you awake." Breakfast in the Great Hall. For a moment, Arya wanted to refuse, to slip away. But she remembered the gentleness in Sansa's eyes, the quiet invitation. She nodded curtly, letting the servant lead her. They traversed corridors that steadily filled with people. Guards in stark gray, maids carrying linens, scribes juggling parchments. Eyes flickered in Arya's direction, curious. Word had spread. Arya kept her face impassive, ignoring the murmurs. In the great hall, a smaller morning meal was underway at the high table. Bowls of porridge, bread, boiled eggs. Lords and ladies milled about, some already wearing travel cloaks. Sansa sat at the center, conferring with a stoop-shouldered man who looked like a steward or advisor. When Arya entered, conversation paused. Heads turned. Sansa rose, meeting Arya's gaze with a tentative smile. She gestured for her sister to join her. An empty chair waited at her side. Arya approached, self-conscious under so many stares. The lords and ladies gawked, some in surprise, others with guarded expressions. A tall woman in mail armor watched her with curiosity, dark eyes flicking to the dagger at Arya's belt. Arya recognized her from glimpses the previous night, presumably the captain of the guard. She offered no challenge, only mild intrigue. Sansa spoke, her voice carrying clear but calm authority. "May I present Arya Stark, my sister? She's returned to us after many trials, and she is welcome in Winterfell." That short announcement seemed to be all Sansa chose to say, leaving the rest to speculation. The watchers bowed or murmured greetings, though Arya could see the questions in their eyes. The stoop-shouldered advisor coughed politely. "Welcome, Lady Arya. It's an honor." Arya gave a tight nod, uncertain what response was expected. She sat in the chair Sansa indicated. A servant promptly placed a bowl of porridge and a mug of hot tea before her. She stared at the food, acutely aware of how unprepared she was for courtly formalities. But Sansa reclaimed the room's attention by addressing some matter of supply distribution in the northern villages. Gradually, talk returned to normal. Arya ate quietly, grateful not to be under constant scrutiny. She found herself marveling at Sansa's ease. Her sister listened to each petitioner, offering a measured reply or delegating tasks to advisors. Once or twice, she turned to Arya, explaining a detail of how they managed grain shipments or oversaw the watchtowers. Arya tried to follow along, but it felt like a different world from the one she knew, one of governance and structure. She was more accustomed to infiltration, secret kills, coded coin trades. Yet she appreciated Sansa's attempt to include her, to make her feel less like an outsider. By the time breakfast ended, the hall had mostly cleared, leaving only a handful of Sansa's closest advisors. Sansa sighed, turning to Arya. "Will you walk with me?" she asked gently. Arya nodded. They rose, exiting through a side door that led into the courtyard. Outside, the air was sharp with the promise of more snowfall, but the morning sun lent the cobblestones a pale glow. Guards drilled near the far wall, swords clanging in a steady rhythm. Stable boys led horses to the trough. It was busy, a castle very much alive. Sansa tucked her hands into a fur muff, walking at an unhurried pace. Arya fell in step, unsure how to begin. At length, Sansa broke the silence. "I didn't want to pry in front of everyone," she said, "but can you tell me anything about where you've been? How you survived?" Arya took a moment, her breath puffing in the cold. She tried to frame it in a way that would not sound too monstrous. "I traveled a great deal," she said slowly. "I ended up in Bravos for a time. I learned many skills." She pressed her lips together, deciding how much to reveal. "I trained under the Faceless men." Sansa's eyes widened, though she tried to mask her shock. "The assassins? The ones who serve the many-faced god?" Arya inclined her head. "Yes, that's how I survived. That's how I—" She trailed off, uncertain whether to speak of her kills. Yet Sansa was no fool. Arya could see the comprehension dawn in her sister's gaze. The reason rumors might swirl of a faceless killer in King's Landing. The many times vengeance had struck those who had wronged House Stark. Sansa said nothing, but her expression revealed a swirl of concern, sadness, and perhaps a glimmer of understanding. They walked in silence for another stretch, passing an archery butts. Arya paused, looking at the targets. straw men crudely painted. She remembered shooting arrows here with Robb and Bran. The times Jon had ruffled her hair, calling her little sister. The memory sliced through her. Sansa stopped beside her, following her gaze. "You can use them if you like," Sansa offered quietly. "I know you were always better with a bow than I was." Arya almost smiled, recalling how Sansa used to hate archery practice, preferring to watch from the sidelines. "Maybe later," Arya murmured. Then she inhaled, forcing herself to turn away. "And you? How did you become Lady of Winterfell?" Sansa's face darkened briefly with old memories. "It's a long story," she said. "I was married to Tyrion Lannister." She paused, seeing Arya's startled look. "An arrangement Joffrey forced upon me. Tyrion was not unkind, but it was complicated. Then I was married to Ramsay Bolton, which was far worse." A haunted flicker crossed her eyes. "In the end, I escaped with help. We reclaimed Winterfell from the Boltons with Jon's assistance. Then, well, events unfolded. Jon chose a different path. I remained here working to rebuild. The Northern Lords accepted me as regent or queen, or whatever they wish to call it. It hasn't been easy." Arya felt her chest tighten at the mention of the Boltons. She knew their cruelty firsthand from rumor and from the tragedies they'd wrought upon the North. She had not known Sansa was forced into such horrors. She swallowed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Sansa gave a small shake of her head. "We've all endured nightmares. It's over now." She managed a steadier look. "In the end, the North stands. That's what matters." They continued through the courtyard, watchers nodding respectfully as they passed. Arya noticed how naturally Sansa returned those nods, how the people gazed at her with genuine admiration or loyalty. The Starks had always been beloved in the North, but Sansa had clearly earned the fealty of these folk through deeds, not just her name. Arya felt a swell of pride. Her sister was truly the Lady of Winterfell. They approached the old weirwood tree in the Godswood. The ancient white trunk towered over the quiet garden, branches dusted with snow. Red leaves rustled in the breeze, giving the impression of an ever-watching face. They stepped onto the mossy ground, away from prying eyes. This place had always carried a hush of reverence. Arya remembered her father kneeling here in prayer. She remembered sneaking around these paths, climbing branches, once dropping an acorn on Sansa's head. The memory made her chest tighten with nostalgia. Sansa paused at the base of the weirwood, turning to Arya. "I come here often to think," she said softly, as if mindful of the old god's presence. "Sometimes I feel their eyes on me, especially when I'm unsure." Arya nodded. The face in the tree stared unblinkingly. "I used to pray here with Father," she murmured. A wave of grief rose, though it was dulled by time. "He told me the old gods watch us, protect us. But so much happened." She trailed off. Sansa laid a hand on the gnarled bark. "Maybe they helped us in ways we don't see," she said quietly. "Or maybe we had to help ourselves. But I still come to remember." Arya let out a shaky breath. She felt the weight of her past pressing in. She had come so far, changed so much, yet these roots ran deep. She reached out tentatively and touched the bark. Felt cool, solid, a link to a world older than any war. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw fleeting images of her father's smile, her mother's loving face. Robb, Bran, Rickon, their voices echoing in the halls of memory. The old gods were silent, but she sensed a faint stirring in her heart, a warmth that whispered of acceptance. She was still Arya, no matter what she had done or what faces she had worn. She was of the North, of Winterfell, bound by blood to these lands. She opened her eyes. Sansa was watching her, tears glistening. Arya felt her own eyes moistening. They stood there, two sisters battered by the storms of the world, reunited at last. Sansa spoke in a hushed tone. "I don't want to press you, but your training as a faceless man, are you still bound to them?" Arya considered. She had finished her tasks in the sense that she had killed those on her list. She had parted ways with the House of Black and White. Yet the skills remained, the knowledge of how to lie, how to kill, how to vanish into shadows. She did not think the many-faced god demanded anything further of her. "I left that life behind," she said at last, though it felt like a half-truth. "I'm not sure if one can ever truly leave, but I won't kill for them again." Sansa nodded slowly, relief mingling with residual worry. "Will you kill for yourself?" Arya's jaw tightened. She recalled Cersei's last breath, the mountain's black gore, Walder Frey's stunned expression before his throat parted. She had been driven by vengeance then. That fire had burned itself out. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't want to keep killing, but I'll defend House Stark if needed." Sansa's shoulders relaxed slightly. She reached out, taking Arya's hand gently. "That's enough for me. Just stay a while. Learn to live without always looking over your shoulder." "You deserve that, Arya." Arya swallowed against a lump in her throat. She realized how exhausted she was, how the endless chase of vengeance had drained her. Perhaps she did want to rest, to find even a moment of peace in the home she had thought lost. "I'll try," she whispered. They lingered in the godswood, letting the hush enfold them. After a time, a servant approached the edge of the grove, clearing his throat politely. "My lady, riders have arrived. One claims to be from the southern group near Moat Cailin. They've brought a message." Sansa exhaled, the weight of leadership returning to her posture. "Very well. Inform them I'll receive them in the great hall shortly." The servant bowed and left. Sansa turned to Arya. "Will you join me? See what these southerners want." Arya hesitated, glancing at the venerable weirwood. She felt torn between the desire to remain in the quiet and the pull of duty. But she saw the flicker of uncertainty in Sansa's eyes, the possibility that these riders might pose a threat. She remembered her vow. If House Stark needed her, she would be there. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I'll come." They left the godswood together, stepping back into the bustle of Winterfell. Servants scurried, guards donned helms. Word had spread that an envoy approached. Sansa led the way to the great hall, which was quickly being readied for a formal meeting. Banners were adjusted, the high seat prepared. Several northern lords had gathered, murmuring about the potential threat. Arya hung back at the edge of the dais, letting Sansa take her seat. She caught a glimpse of the courtyard through the open door. A group of riders dismounting, wearing plain cloaks and hoods, a single white banner raised above them. They were ushered inside by watchful guards. Arya's instincts tingled. She scanned the newcomers. Their leader was a tall, lean man, maybe in his 30s, with sharp features and a confident stride. He bowed low to Sansa. "My lady," he said with a smooth southern accent. "I bring greetings from the Stormlands, and from those who would see Westeros united in peace." Sansa eyed him calmly. "You carry no sigil." "Why?" The man offered a practiced smile. "We come on a delicate mission, not wishing to cause alarm or reveal alliances prematurely. My name is Ser Jason Trant." He gestured to his men, who lowered their hoods. "We've heard rumors that the North stands apart, forging its own destiny. We wish to discuss how best to approach a shared future." Arya's brow furrowed at the name. Trant. Meryn Trant had been on her kill list, and she had dispatched him years ago in Bravos. This man claimed to be from the Stormlands, but the name pricked her memory. She watched him intently. Sansa must have noticed the flicker in Arya's eyes, because she shot her sister a questioning glance. Arya gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head, indicating she would hold her peace for now. Sansa spoke with careful courtesy. "We are always open to peaceful dialogue, Ser Jason, but I must know who you truly represent. Are you allied with any lord or lady we would recognize?" A slight tension flickered in the man's face. "We speak for several noble houses that have tired of the unending wars. They seek a new stability in the wake of King's Landing's changes." Arya crossed her arms, studying his bearing, the way his eyes moved. He was practiced at diplomacy, clearly, yet something about his smoothness reminded her of the many deceitful courtiers she had once spied upon. She let her gaze wander to his companions. Half a dozen men, one or two with faintly tarnished armor, a few with no armor at all. They looked capable, but not battered enough to be a ragged mercenary band. More like personal retainers. She saw the tension in their shoulders, the way they scanned the hall, measuring guard positions. Caution, or something more sinister. Sansa's expression was polite but cool. If your message is about forging alliances, I'm sure we can speak in detail. However, if the southern houses wish to unite under one banner again, they must look to themselves first. The North is independent. Her voice rang with quiet resolve. We paid too high a price to bend the knee again. Ser Jason's lips twitched in something like frustration, but he dipped his head. Of course, we fully respect the North's sovereignty. Our hope is to coordinate resources, perhaps open trade routes, discuss mutual defense pacts. The past is full of misunderstandings. Let us not repeat them. As he spoke, Arya noticed the slight shift in his men's posture. Two of them seemed especially restless, hands hovering near their scabbards. She felt the old reflexes stirring. Why so tense if this was a peaceful proposal? She edged closer to Sansa's chair, just in case. Sansa listened, her hands folded in her lap. We'll consider your proposals in good faith. For now, you and your men are welcome as guests. You'll be shown quarters in the keep and... One of Ser Jason's men suddenly coughed, a harsh rasp that sounded too forceful. Arya's eyes darted to him. The man tapped his chest, feigning a struggle for breath. Another in the group shifted behind him. Arya recognized the maneuver at once. A distraction. She tensed, her hand finding the hilt of her dagger. In a heartbeat, the second man lunged forward, blade flashing from under his cloak. He aimed directly at Sansa's guard who stood near the dais. The guard, caught off guard, barely got his sword up in time. Steel clashed, echoing through the hall. Pandemonium erupted. Northern lords shouted, drawing weapons. Ser Jason stepped back swiftly, as if expecting this. Another of his men rushed forward, slashing at a different guard. The hall erupted into chaos. Arya sprang into motion, stepping in front of Sansa. One of the attackers rushed the dais, sword held low for a quick gut stab. Arya's dagger met him halfway. She sidestepped his strike and buried the blade under his ribcage with a fluid twist, exactly as she had been taught in Bravos. He gasped, eyes bulging, and collapsed. She spun, scanning for more threats. Ser Jason was yelling something. Stop! Stand down! But his men ignored him, or perhaps this had been part of the plan all along. Two were already locked in combat with Stark guards. Another advanced on Sansa with a short spear. Arya darted forward, intercepting him. Her movements were swift, lethal. She slipped beneath his thrust, slashed his thigh, then cut across his throat in one smooth motion. Blood sprayed, spattering the dais. Sansa gasped, half rising from her chair. Northern guards flooded in from the sides, swords and spears at the ready. Ser Jason ducked a blow, swearing. Traitors! He shouted at his own men, or perhaps at the Starks. It was unclear. He parried a guard's thrust with surprising skill, then disarmed him with a deft twist. Before the guard could recover, Ser Jason plunged his sword into the man's abdomen. Arya's eyes narrowed. This was no mere diplomat. She circled around, pushing Sansa back toward the safety of the dais steps. The swirl of combat churned across the hall. Stark soldiers quickly overwhelmed the lesser fighters among the Southerners, but Ser Jason stood in the center like a trained killer. Another guard lunged at him. He countered, twisting behind the man, placing his sword against the guard's throat. The guard froze, breath ragged. Enough! Ser Jason snapped, using the guard as a human shield. Blood dripped from his blade. The hall fell into a tense hush, broken only by the moans of the wounded. 4 of his men lay dead or dying, while the rest were disarmed, pinned by furious Stark warriors. The captured guard in Ser Jason's grip trembled, eyes darting to Sansa. Sansa stood tall at the dais, face pale but determined. Arya hovered near her, dagger ready, her heart pounding. Ser Jason edged backward slowly, taking the guard with him. "Open that door!" He barked at a Stark footman near the main entrance. "Let me pass or he dies." The footman looked to Sansa, uncertain. Sansa's jaw tightened. She spoke calmly but loudly. "Release him. We can still talk." "Talk?" Ser Jason gave a hollow laugh. "My men are dead. Your guards attacked first." A northern lord snarled. "Lies! You drew steel first." Ser Jason sneered. "What does it matter? We were doomed from the start. So much for parley." He inched closer to the door, scanning for an escape route. Arya moved swiftly along the perimeter of the hall, hoping to circle behind him. But he saw her, hissed in warning, pressing the blade closer to the guard's throat. The guard whimpered. Arya froze, measuring angles. A single well-thrown knife might do it if she could catch him off guard. Sansa lifted her chin. "Stand down, Ser Jason. You can surrender. You'll be treated fairly." He laughed bitterly. "Fairly as a murderer or conspirator? I think not." He moved another step, dragging the guard with him. "You think you can quell the southern lords so easily? You Stark dogs are no better than the rest, always." His words cut short. Arya had seized her chance. A fleeting moment when his gaze flicked to Sansa. She hurled her dagger in a swift, lethal arc. It found its mark in his sword arm, sinking deep into the muscle near the shoulder. He yelped, reflexively releasing his hostage. The guard stumbled free. Arya closed the distance in an instant, drawing a second blade from her belt. Ser Jason tried to raise his sword, but his injured arm trembled. She knocked it aside and kicked him in the knee. He crashed to the floor, cursing. Before he could recover, she had the point of her blade at his throat. He glared up at her, breath angry hard. Blood trickled from the wound in his shoulder. The hall was silent, all eyes on the scene. Arya met his gaze coldly, her chest heaving. She felt that old killer's instinct surging, the part of her that wanted to finish it cleanly. But she sensed Sansa behind her, saw the wide eyes of northern lords, realized that killing him in front of everyone might not be the choice Sansa would make. With effort, she reined in the impulse. Ser Jason's lip curled. A Stark savage with the reflexes of an assassin. "They said the lost wolf was dead. But I see you're quite alive." He spat, ignoring the blade pressed to his neck. "This won't end here." Arya stared down at him, the flat of her dagger glinting. "Maybe not," she said quietly. "But it ends for you if you move." Sansa stepped forward, regaining her composure. "Take him," she commanded the guards. Several leapt to obey, wrestling Ser Jason's sword away and binding his arms. He winced as the dagger remained lodged in his shoulder. Another guard moved to subdue the wounded among the attackers. Sansa's voice carried. "We'll get answers from him. The rest will be put to questioning. See to our wounded, and clean this mess." The tension broke as the hall erupted in activity. Arya stood, panting slightly. She retrieved her first dagger from Ser Jason's shoulder with one firm yank. He groaned, eyes rolling back in pain. The guards dragged him away. Blood stained the stones where he had fallen. Arya wiped her blade on a scrap of cloth. She felt eyes upon her, some in awe, others unsettled. She'd moved like a shadow, as lethal as any warrior they had seen. Sansa approached, placing a trembling hand on Arya's shoulder. "Thank you," she murmured. "You saved lives." Arya released a slow breath, her nerves thrumming. She nodded. I did what I had to do." She glanced around at the carnage. They were no mere envoys. Some ploy to sow chaos, perhaps. Sansa's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll find out, but at least you're here." She hesitated, then pulled Arya into a brief, fierce embrace. Arya stiffened at the unexpected gesture, but then let herself melt into it for a moment, feeling the tremor in Sansa's arms. Yes, she thought, at least I'm here. When Sansa released her, the lady turned to oversee the aftermath, giving orders to secure the prisoners, tend to the wounded, and ensure the great hall was cleaned. Arya stood off to the side, her hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. She was not used to saving people. Usually, she was the quiet ender of lives. But here, she had acted in defense of her sister and her home. A strange feeling of satisfaction tempered the cold edge inside her. In the hours that followed, the castle bustled with heightened alert. The captured men were taken to the dungeons. Maesters tended to the injured. Sansa's advisors gathered to discuss the incident, speculating about who had sent these false envoys. Arya participated only at the edges of the discussions, letting others handle the negotiations. She had no desire to become a court figure, but when Sansa asked for her insight, she did not hold back. She suspected these men might have been hired swords, possibly with ties to lords unsettled by the Queen's death, seeking to provoke a confrontation with the North. That suggested more conspiracies swirling in the South, a power vacuum left by Cersei's demise that was now fueling new conflicts. Sansa listened, nodding gravely. "We must stay vigilant," she told her advisors. "Send ravens to our allies. Let them know we'll not be caught unawares." The day wore on. By twilight, the initial shock had settled. The great hall was cleaned, though the lingering scent of spilled blood mixed with pine-scented water used for scrubbing. Sansa invited Arya to dine in a smaller solar, away from the crowd. There, they shared a quiet meal, just the two of them. The chamber was cozy, warmed by a brazier. A single candle glowed on the table. Sansa wore a soft gown of gray wool trimmed with white fur, her hair pinned in braids. Arya sat opposite her in travel-worn leathers, feeling like a wild thing in contrast. Yet Sansa's smile was gentle, unjudging. They talked a little of mundane things, the taste of the stew, the quality of the winter stores, the repairs to certain towers. Neither mentioned the events in the Great Hall until Sansa set down her spoon and said, "Thank you again for protecting us today. I see you haven't lost your skill with a blade." Arya gave a faint shrug. It was second nature. Sansa studied her. "Do you ever regret it? That you learned to kill so young?" Arya considered. Once, she had been proud of her deadly prowess, seeing it as justice for her family. Now that the list was done, a hollowness remained. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but it was necessary, kept me alive. It brought me here." She paused. "I don't want to regret it, because it's part of me, but I'm trying to see if there's more to life than death." Sansa's eyes softened. "I'm glad to hear that," she said quietly. "I remember how fierce you were as a child, always chafing against the things I enjoyed. We were so different, but maybe we needed both perspectives to survive." Arya almost smiled. "Maybe so." They lapsed into a more comfortable silence. After dinner, Sansa walked with Arya to the corridor outside her chambers. The flickering torchlight made the shadows dance on the walls. Sansa turned, searching Arya's gaze. "Stay as long as you like," she said gently. "Winterfell is your home. Whatever you decide, know that you have a place here." Arya felt an unexpected warmth spread through her. She nodded. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, but Sansa smiled, understanding shining in her eyes. They parted ways. Arya stepped into her guest chamber, exhaling slowly. She felt a strange sense of belonging that she had not expected, tempered by the knowledge that the realm was still rife with conflict. If southern conspirators were bold enough to send assassins disguised as envoys, what else might come? She could see a path before her. Staying in Winterfell, helping Sansa secure the north, perhaps forging a new purpose besides vengeance. It frightened her, this notion of building a life rather than destroying one. Late that night, she found herself unable to sleep, so she slipped out into the courtyard. The moonlit sky gleamed with stars, the cold air sharp. The castle was quiet, save for the occasional guard patrolling. Arya wandered toward the archery butts. She picked up a bow left near the fence, tested its tension. A quiver of arrows leaned against the wall. She knocked one, drew back, and aimed at the straw target in the distance. She released, the arrow thudding into the dummy's shoulder. Her aim was still decent, though not perfect. She retrieved the arrow and fired again, adjusting her stance. Each shot felt like reacquainting herself with a part of who she once was, the girl who had stolen arrows to practice in secret, defying the norms of a lady's duties. She took a deep breath, drew again, released. The arrow struck closer to the center. A faint smile tugged at her lips. Perhaps the ghosts of her childhood could be reclaimed in small ways. "Not bad," came a voice behind her. She turned, startled, to see Sansa watching from a short distance, wrapped in a thick cloak. Her sister offered a hesitant grin. "You used to practice at night, too. I remember." Arya lowered the bow. "Yes," she said softly. "I did." Sansa approached, her breath forming little clouds in the moonlight. "Mind if I watch?" Arya shook her head. She raised the bow again, loosed another arrow. This one flew true, sinking into the target's midsection. Sansa gave a small clap, a gentle laugh. "You've improved, but I suppose that's no surprise." Arya handed her the bow. "Want to try?" Sansa cringed playfully. "You know I'm terrible. Perhaps you're better now," Arya teased, the flicker of a sisterly bond easing the tension. Sansa sighed, then gamely took the bow. She drew the string with obvious difficulty, aimed, and released. The arrow sailed wide, glancing off the hay bale. Sansa let out a half laugh, half groan. "Clearly not." Arya retrieved the arrow for her. "Again," she said, standing beside Sansa, adjusting her sister's elbows gently. "Like this. Loosen your shoulders." Sansa complied, exhaling slowly. She fired again, and this time the arrow at least hit the edge of the target. Sansa brightened. "That's better than usual." They exchanged a small smile. In that quiet moment, under the moon and stars, the horrors of the day melted away. They were sisters again, bridging the chasm of years and terrors with a few arrows and shared laughter. When they finally returned to the keep, Arya felt lighter, a fragile hope blossoming inside her. Perhaps she could stay. Perhaps she could become something more than an instrument of death. The future was as uncertain as the swirling constellations overhead, but at least she was not alone. She climbed into bed, still in her tunic, but for once, she set her dagger aside on the bedside table. The comfort of that small gesture lingered as she drifted into a sleep free of nightmares. She dreamt of Winterfell's towers shining in summer light, her family gathered for a feast. She dreamt of laughter echoing through the courtyard. When morning came, she woke with tears on her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow alone. They were tears of memory, of possibility. In the days that followed, Arya found a cautious routine. She joined Sansa at occasional meals or walks, learning more about the North's current alliances. She observed the guards' training, sometimes offering pointers that left them gaping at her skill. She visited the library, scanning old tomes about Bravos and the known world, feeling a strange sense of belonging and displacement all at once. And when the quiet times came, she would slip into the Godswood or climb the ramparts, her mind adrift in thoughts of who she had been and who she might become. Sometimes she thought of the many faces she had worn, tucked safely in a hidden trunk in her chamber, just a few that she had kept as fallback disguises. She wondered if she would ever need them again. Now, in Winterfell, she had no cause to hide, and that, she realized, was the greatest change of all. A fortnight passed, and though the realm beyond was still unsteady, Winterfell knew a relative calm. Sansa and her advisors questioned Ser Jason, gleaning half-truths about southern plots. He admitted some lords, furious at Cersei's assassination and the subsequent power struggles, hoped to spark conflict in the north, to force the Starks into war or subjugation. His men were under orders to provoke an incident if negotiations failed. He refused to name names, but hints of Stormland involvement came through. Sansa prepared for the possibility of further attacks, quietly shoring up defenses. Arya found her place in the midst of it, offering counsel, training a small group of scouts in stealth techniques, ensuring that any future infiltrators would be caught. Yet she often kept to the shadows, not wanting a prominent role. She was still adjusting to the idea of belonging in plain sight. Each day, she and Sansa found a moment to speak privately or to share a meal. They never pressed each other too hard about the past, but piece by piece, stories emerged. Sansa's trials in King's Landing and the Eyrie, Arya's time in Bravos, the tragedies they both endured. Each conversation knitted them closer, forging a bond that had been absent when they were girls. On one crisp afternoon, Arya and Sansa stood on the walls of Winterfell, gazing at the snow-dusted landscape. Servants bustled below, reinforcing the courtyard gates. Sansa inhaled the cold air. "Arya," she said gently, "I've been thinking. I know you have your own path, but you've done so much to protect us these past days. If you wanted a formal position here, as my chief scout or bodyguard, you need only say. The people would follow your lead." Arya looked out over the fields, her breath puffing. She considered Sansa's words. A part of her thrilled at the idea of having a place at last, protecting House Stark openly. Another part worried that she would never be at ease in a fixed role, that her restless spirit and the skills she'd honed might chafe under routine. She turned to Sansa, about to speak. Before she could respond, a horn sounded from the gatehouse. A rider approached, wearing Stark colors and shouting something about visitors from the west. Arya and Sansa exchanged a glance, tension rippling. Another envoy, or something else? A guard leaned over the rampart, calling to them. "My lady!" A group rides under a direwolf banner, with outriders from the Vale. They say they come in peace, led by Lord Baelish's successor, perhaps. Sansa's face hardened at the mention of Baelish, but she squared her shoulders. "Very well, let them in. We'll see who's come to treat with us now." Arya noticed the flicker of anxiety in Sansa's eyes. She reached out, squeezed her sister's hand briefly. "We'll face them together," she said. Sansa nodded. They descended to the courtyard, the crisp wind tugging at their cloaks. The gates creaked open, admitting a small party of riders, their banners showing the moon and falcon of House Arryn and the direwolf of House Stark side by side. Leading them was a woman in a deep blue cloak, accompanied by several knights with battered sigils from the Vale. They reined in before Sansa, dismounting. The woman pulled back her hood, revealing a stern face framed by graying hair. "Lady Sansa," she said with an air of familiarity, "I bring greetings from the Vale. We've come to reaffirm our ties, if you'll have us." Sansa recognized her, it seemed. "Lady Anya Waynwood," she said, relief coloring her voice. "Welcome. The Vale remains an ally. It's good to see you." Lady Waynwood nodded. "The Vale stands with the North. We've heard rumors of trouble, and I wish to ensure you had our support, especially after the news from King's Landing." Sansa offered a small smile. "Much appreciated. Come inside, we'll speak in comfort." She turned to Arya, making introductions. "My sister, Arya Stark." Lady Waynwood inclined her head. "An unexpected pleasure. Your family has endured. The Vale is grateful to the Starks for past alliances. May we continue in peace." Arya studied Lady Waynwood and her companions. They seemed sincere enough, lacking the hidden tension that had betrayed the false envoys. Perhaps not all southern interests were deceitful. She nodded politely. They led the arrivals into the hall, exchanging courtesies. Servants hurried to fetch mulled wine and seats. Sansa introduced Lady Waynwood to various northern lords. Arya stood near, watchful but not intrusive. Through the chatter, she gleaned that the Vale had stabilized after Littlefinger's death, now ruled by a regency council for young Lord Robert Arryn, with Lady Waynwood as a key figure. They wanted to strengthen ties with the North, ensuring mutual protection against any southern aggression. Arya watched Sansa negotiate the details calmly. Their talk covered trade routes through the mountain passes, the potential for joint patrols along the Vale border. Lady Waynwood spoke plainly, without subterfuge. Arya felt a measure of respect for her forthright manner. This was how alliances should be made, openly, with clear terms, not the duplicity she had seen so often. At the end of the discussion, Lady Waynwood turned to Sansa, expression earnest. "I must ask, my lady, with the realm in chaos, what is the North's stance? Will you remain entirely separate? Or do you see a time when all might unite again under one ruler, or perhaps a council, if it ensures lasting peace?" A hush fell. This was the crux of the matter for many lords, the future shape of the Seven Kingdoms, or however many remained. Arya saw Sansa's eyes flick to her. Then Sansa straightened. "The North will not bend the knee to any southern throne," she said firmly. "We've lost too much to do so again, but we're not unwilling to stand in mutual defense if a threat arises that endangers us all. We'll remain watchful. For now, that is the best answer I can give." Lady Waynwood accepted this with a nod. "A fair stance. The Vale respects your sovereignty. Still, I hope we can rely on you should greater troubles stir. And if you call on the Vale for aid, we will come." An agreement was reached, one of caution, mutual respect, and a vow of friendship. Handshakes were exchanged, cups of wine raised. Arya watched from the side, feeling a quiet pride in Sansa's sure-handed leadership. This was not some timid lady battered by events. This was a Stark forging a new destiny for the North. As the evening wound down, Lady Waynwood and her party were shown to their rooms. Sansa retreated to her solar, weary from negotiations. Arya accompanied her, the two slipping away from the bustle. In the privacy of that chamber, Sansa collapsed into a chair, rubbing her temples. "That went better than I expected," she said with relief. "At least the Vale remains steadfast." Arya leaned against the wall. "You're forging a real future for the North, Sansa." Sansa gave a thin smile, trying to anyway, one step at a time. She looked at Arya with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "What about you? Have you decided if you'll stay?" Arya hesitated. The question she had been wrestling with drifted back to the surface. She felt the pull of the open road, the old habit of drifting. But she also felt the warmth of belonging here in Winterfell, reuniting with Sansa, protecting the home she once lost. She thought of the archery butts under the moonlight, the hush of the godswood. She thought of the assassin's masks tucked away in her trunk. Did she truly need them now? She stepped closer to Sansa, letting out a slow breath. "I want to stay," she said quietly, hearing the tremor in her own voice. "At least for a while. I'm not sure I'm ready to forget who I was or what I've done. But I think—" She paused, searching for words. "I think being here might help me remember who I once wanted to be." Sansa's eyes shone with relief. She stood, took Arya's hands in hers. "Then stay. We'll figure out the rest together." A strange sense of peace settled over Arya. A new journey awaited. A journey not fueled by revenge, but by the desire to rebuild, to protect, to stand beside her family. She had killed every name on her list, completed every vengeance she had sworn. And now she had returned to the place where she had first learned who she was. The weight of old grudges lifted, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt an inkling of hope. She would remain Arya Stark of Winterfell, the sister who had wandered distant roads and learned the faces of death. She would sleep under her own roof, share quiet meals with her kin, and hone her skills not for vengeance but for the North's defense. If the realm demanded war again, she would be ready to fight by Sansa's side. If peace prevailed, she would find her place in this new world. And through it all, she would remember the darkness of her past without letting it consume her. Night fell upon Winterfell once more. Beneath the quiet sky and the watchful gaze of the old gods, Arya walked to the courtyard, eyes drifting to the windows of the keep where her sister retired. A faint glow marked Sansa's chamber. Arya allowed herself a small, genuine smile. She knelt, touching the cold stones, recalling her father's words. "When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives." She was home. She was not alone. And so the many-faced shadows that once haunted her began to recede, leaving in their wake the first gentle stirrings of what might become a new life. She rose, gazing at the ancient walls, and let the soft hush of Winterfell embrace her. The last names on her list were gone, their debts paid in blood or absolved by mercy. Now the only name that mattered was her own. Arya Stark, home at last.